Book One, Chapter 1 of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens.
Mr. Gradgrind, read by Marty Chris.
Sissy Jupe, read by Jen Raimundo.
Bitzer, read by M.B.
Gentleman, read by Tom Crawford.
Louisa Gradgrind, read by Ariel Lipshaw.
Mr. Bounderby, read by Andy Minter.
Mrs. Gradgrind, read by Beth Thomas.
Tom Gradgrind, read by Max Schörlinger.
Childers, read by David Lawrence.
Kidderminster, read by Elizabeth Klett.
Mr. Sleary, read by Ron Altman.
Mrs. Sparsit, read by Elizabeth Klett.
Stephen Blackpool, read by Nigel Boydell.
Rachel, performed by Karen Savage.
Mrs. Blackpool, read by Darvinia.
Mrs. Pegler, read by Sally McConnell.
Mr. James Harthouse, read by Algie Pugg.
Slackbridge, read by John Steigerwald.
Voice 1, read by Sylvia.
Voice 2, read by Jen Raimundo.
Chairman, read by Elizabeth Klett.
Jane Gradgrind, read by Goldfish.
Waiter, read by Nigel Boydell.
Man, read by Algie Pugg.
Clown, read by Darvinia.
Narration read by Bob Neufeld. Book 1, Sewing. Chapter 1, The One Thing Needful.
Now what I want is facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are wanted in life. Plant nothing else and root out everything else. You can only form the minds of reasoning animals upon facts. Nothing else will ever be of any service to them. This is the principle on which I bring up my own children, and this is the principle on which I bring up these children. Stick to the facts, sir.
The scene was a plain, bare, monotonous vault of a schoolroom, and the speaker's square forefinger emphasized his observations by underscoring every sentence with a line on the schoolmaster's sleeve. The emphasis was helped by the speaker's square wall of a forehead, which had his eyebrows for its base, while his eyes found commodious cellarage in two dark caves, overshadowed by the wall. The emphasis was helped by the speaker's mouth, which was wide, thin, and hard-set. The emphasis was helped by the speaker's voice, which was inflexible, dry, and dictatorial. The emphasis was helped by the speaker's hair, which bristled on the skirts of his bald head, a plantation of furs to keep the wind from its shining surface, all covered with knobs like the crust of a plum pie, as if the head had scarcely warehouse room for the hard facts stored inside. The speaker's obstinate carriage, square coat, square legs, square shoulders, nay, his very neckcloth, trained to take him by the throat with an unaccommodating grasp, like a stubborn fact, as it was, all helped the emphasis.
In this life we want nothing but facts, sir. Nothing but facts.
The speaker, and the schoolmaster, and the third grown person present, all backed a little, and swept with their eyes the inclined plane of little vessels then and there arranged in order, ready to have imperial gallons of facts poured into them until they were full to the brim. End of chapter 1. Book 1, Chapter 2 of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Book 1, Chapter 2. murdering the innocent. Thomas Gradgrind, sir, a man of realities, a man of facts and calculations, a man who proceeds upon the principle that 2 and 2 are 4 and nothing over, and who is not to be talked into allowing for anything over. Thomas Gradgrind, sir. Peremptorily Thomas Gradgrind. With a rule and a pair of scales, and the multiplication tables always in his pocket, sir, ready to weigh and measure any parcel of human nature, and tell you exactly what it comes to. It is a mere question of figures, a case of simple arithmetic. You might hope to get some other nonsensical belief into the head of George Gradgrind, or Augustus Gradgrind, or John Gradgrind, or Joseph Gradgrind, all supposititious non-existent persons. But into the head of Thomas Gradgrind, no, sir. In such terms Mr. Gradgrind always mentally introduced himself, whether to his private circle of acquaintance, or to the public in general. In such terms, no doubt, substituting the words boys and girls for sir, Thomas Gradgrind now presented Thomas Gradgrind to the little pitchers before him, who were to be filled so full of facts. Indeed, as he eagerly sparkled at them from the cellarage before mentioned, he seemed a kind of cannon, loaded to the muzzle with facts, and preparing to blow them clean out of the regions of childhood at one discharge. He seemed a galvanizing apparatus, too, charged with a grim mechanical substitute for the tender young imaginations that were to be stormed away.
Girl number 20,
said Mr. Gradgrind, squarely pointing with his square forefinger.
I don't know that girl. Who is that girl?
Sissy Jupe, sir,
explained number 20, blushing, standing up, and curtsying.
Sissy is not a name,
said Mr. Gradgrind.
Don't call yourself Sissy. Call yourself Cecilia.
It's father as calls me Sissy, sir,
returned the young girl in a trembling voice, and with another curtsy.
Then he has no business to do it,
said Mr. Gradgrind.
Tell him he mustn't. Cecilia Jupe. Let me see. What is your father?
He belongs to the horse riding, if you please, sir.
Mr. Gradgrind frowned, and waved off the objectionable calling with his hand.
We don't want to know anything about that here. You mustn't tell us about that here. Your father breaks horses, don't he?
If you please, sir, when they can get any to break, they do break horses in the ring, sir.
You mustn't tell us about the ring here. Very well, then. Describe your father as a horsebreaker. He doctors sick horses, I dare say.
Oh, yes, sir.
Very well, then. He is a veterinary surgeon, a farrier, and horsebreaker. Give me your definition of a horse.
Sissy Jupe, thrown into the greatest alarm by this demand.
Girl number 20, unable to define a horse,
said Mr. Gradgrind, for the general behoof of all the little pitchers.
Girl number 20, possessed of no facts in reference to one of the commonest of animals. Some boy's definition of a horse. Bitzer, yours.
The square finger, moving here and there, lighted suddenly on Bitzer. Perhaps because he chanced to sit in the same ray of sunlight which, darting in at one of the bare windows of the intensely whitewashed room, irradiated Sissy. For the boys and girls sat on the face of the inclined plane in 2 compact bodies, divided up the centre by a narrow interval, and Sissy, being at the corner of a row on the sunny side, came in for the beginning of a sunbeam, of which Bitzer, being at the corner of a row on the other side, a few rows in advance, caught the end. But whereas the girl was so dark-eyed and dark-haired that she seemed to receive a deeper and more lustrous colour from the sun when it shone upon her, the boy was so light-eyed and light-haired that the self-same rays appeared to draw out of him what little colour he ever possessed. His cold eyes could hardly have been eyes, but for the short ends of lashes which, by bringing them into immediate contrast with something paler than themselves, expressed their form. His short-cropped hair might have been a mere continuation of the sandy freckles on his forehead and face. His skin was so unwholesomely deficient in the natural tinge, that he looked as though, if he were cut, he would bleed white.
"Bitzer,"
said Mr. Gradgrind,
"your definition of a horse."
Quadruped, graminivorous, 40 teeth, namely 24 grinders, 4 eye teeth, and 12 incisive. Sheds coat in the spring. In marshy countries sheds hoofs too. Hoofs hard, but requiring to be shod with iron. Age known by marks in mouth.
Thus, and much more, Bitzer.
"Now, girl number 20,"
said Mr. Gradgrind,
"you know what a horse is."
She curtsied again, and would have blushed deeper, if she could have blushed deeper than she had blushed all this time. Bitzer, after rapidly blinking at Thomas Gradgrind with both eyes at once, and so catching the light upon his quivering ends of lashes, that they looked like the antennae of busy insects, put his knuckles to his freckled forehead, and sat down again. The third gentleman now stepped forth. A mighty man at cutting and drying he was, a government officer. In his way, and in most other people's too, a professed pugilist, always in training, always with a system to force down the general throat like a bolus, always to be heard of at the bar of his little public office, ready to fight all England. To continue in fistic phraseology, he had a genius for coming up to the scratch, wherever and whatever it was, and proving himself an ugly customer. He would go in and damage any subject whatever with his right, follow up with his left, stop, exchange, counter, bore his opponent, he always fought all England, to the ropes, and fall upon him neatly. He was certain to knock the wind out of common sense, and render that unlucky adversary deaf to the call of time. And he had it in charge from high authority to bring about the great public office millennium, when commissioners should reign upon earth.
"Very well,"
said this gentleman, briskly smiling and folding his arms.
"That's a horse. Now let me ask you, boys and girls, would you paper a room with representations of horses?"
After a pause, one half of the children cried in chorus, "Yes, sir," upon which the other half, seeing in the gentleman's face that yes was wrong, cried out in chorus, "No, sir," as the custom is in these examinations.
"Of course no. Why wouldn't you?"
A pause. One corpulent slow boy, with a wheezing manner of breathing, ventured the answer, "Because he wouldn't paper a room at all, but would paint it."
"You must paper it,"
said the gentleman, rather warmly.
"You must paper it,"
said Thomas Gradgrind.
"Whether you like it or not. Don't tell us you wouldn't paper it. What do you mean, boy?"
"I'll explain to you, then,"
said the gentleman, after another and dismal pause,
"why you wouldn't paper a room with representations of horses. Do you ever see horses walking up and down the sides of room in reality, in fact? Do you?"
"Yes, sir," from one half. "No, sir," from the other.
"Of course no,"
said the gentleman, with an indignant look at the wrong half.
"Why then you are not to see anywhere what you don't see in fact. You are not to have anywhere what you don't have in fact. What is called taste is only another name for fact."
Thomas Gradgrind nodded his approbation.
"This is a new principle, a discovery, a great discovery,"
said the gentleman.
"Now, I'll try you again. Suppose you were going to carpet a room. Would you use a carpet having a representation of flowers upon it?"
There being a general conviction by this time that "No, sir," was always the right answer to this gentleman, the chorus of "No" was very strong. Only a few feeble stragglers said yes, among them Sissy Jupe.
"Girl number 20,"
said the gentleman, smiling in the calm strength of knowledge. Sissy blushed and stood up.
"So you would carpet your room, or your husband's room, if you were a grown woman and had a husband, with representations of flowers, would you?"
said the gentleman.
"Why would you?"
If you please, sir, I am very fond of flowers,
returned the girl.
And that is why you would put tables and chairs upon them, and have people walking over them with heavy boots?
It wouldn't hurt them, sir. They wouldn't crush and wither, if you please, sir. They would be the pictures of what was very pretty and pleasant, and I would fancy—
Aye, but you mustn't fancy,
cried the gentleman, quite elated by coming so happily to his point.
That's it. You are never to fancy.
You are not, Cecilia Jupe,
Thomas Gradgrind solemnly repeated,
to do anything of that kind.
Fact, fact, fact,
said the gentleman.
Fact, fact, fact,
repeated Thomas Gradgrind.
You are to be in all things regulated and governed,
said the gentleman,
by fact. We hope to have, before long, a board of fact, composed of commissioners of fact, who will force the people to be a people of fact, and of nothing but fact. You must discard the word fancy altogether. You have nothing to do with it. You are not to have, in any object of use or ornament, what would be a contradiction in fact. You don't walk upon flowers in fact. You cannot be allowed to walk upon flowers and carpets. You don't find that foreign birds and butterflies come and perch upon your crockery. You cannot be permitted to paint foreign birds and butterflies upon your crockery. You never meet with quadrupeds going up and down walls. You must not have quadrupeds represented upon walls. You must use,
said the gentleman,
for all these purposes, combinations and modifications, in primary colors, of mathematical figures which are susceptible of proof and demonstration. This is the new discovery. This is fact. This is taste.
The girl curtsied and sat down. She was very young, and she looked as if she were frightened by the matter-of-fact prospect the world afforded.
Now, if Mr. Choakumchild,
said the gentleman,
will proceed to give his first lesson here, Mr. Gradgrind, I shall be happy, at your request, to observe his mode of procedure.
Mr. Gradgrind was much obliged.
Mr. Choakumchild, we only wait for you.
So Mr. McChoakumchild began in his best manner. He and some 140 other schoolmasters had been lately turned at the same time in the same factory on the same principles, like so many pianoforte legs. He had been put through an immense variety of paces, and had answered volumes of head-breaking questions, orthography, etymology, syntax, and prosody, biography, astronomy, geography, and general cosmography, the sciences of compound proportion, algebra, land surveying and levelling, vocal music, and drawing from models, were all at the ends of his 10 chilled fingers. He had worked his stony way into Her Majesty's Most Honourable Privy Council's Schedule B, and had taken the bloom off the higher branches of mathematics and physical science, French, German, Latin, and Greek. He knew all about all the watersheds of all the world, whatever they are, and all the histories of all the peoples, and all the names of all the rivers and mountains, and all the productions, manners, and customs of all the countries, and all their boundaries and bearings on the 32 points of the compass. Ah, rather overdone, McChoakumchild. If he had only learnt a little less, how infinitely better he might have taught much more. He went to work in this preparatory lesson, not unlike Morgiana in the 40 Thieves, looking into all the vessels ranged before him, one after another, to see what they contained. Say, good McChoakumchild, when from thy boiling store thou shalt fill each jar brimful by and by, dost thou think that thou wilt always kill outright the rubber fancy lurking within, or sometimes only maim him and distort him? End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Hard Times by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times by Charles Dickens. Chapter 3. A Loophole. Mr. Gradgrind walked homeward from the school in a state of considerable satisfaction. It was his school, and he intended it to be a model. He intended every child in it to be a model, just as the young Gradgrinds were all models. There were 5 young Gradgrinds, and they were models every one. They had been lectured at from their tenderest years, coursed like little hares. Almost as soon as they could run alone, they had been made to run to the lecture-room. The first object with which they had an association, or of which they had a remembrance, was a large blackboard with a dry ogre chalking ghastly white figures on it. Not that they knew, by name or nature, anything about an ogre. Fact forbid. I only use the word to express a monster in a lecturing castle, with heaven knows how many heads manipulated into one, taking childhood captive and dragging it into gloomy statistical dens by the hair. No little Gradgrind had ever seen a face in the moon. It was up in the moon before it could speak distinctly. No little Gradgrind had ever learnt the silly jingle, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are." No little Gradgrind had ever known wonder on the subject. Each little Gradgrind having at 5 years old dissected the Great Bear like a Professor Owen, and driven Charles's Wain like a locomotive engine-driver. No little Gradgrind had ever associated a cow in a field with that famous cow with the crumpled horn, who tossed the dog, who worried the cat, who killed the rat, who ate the malt, or with that yet more famous cow who swallowed Tom Thumb. It had never heard of those celebrities, and had only been introduced to a cow as a graminivorous ruminating quadruped with several stomachs. To his matter-of-fact home, which was called Stone Lodge, Mr. Gradgrind directed his steps. He had virtually retired from the wholesale hardware trade before he built Stone Lodge, and was now looking about for a suitable opportunity of making an arithmetical figure in Parliament. Stone Lodge was sitting on a moor within a mile or 2 of a great town, called Coketown in the present faithful guide-book. A regular feature on the face of the country, Stone Lodge was. Not the least disguise toned down or shaded off that uncompromising fact in the landscape. A great square house, with a heavy portico darkening the principal windows, as its master's heavy brows overshadowed his eyes. A calculated, cast-up, balanced, and proved house. 6 windows on this side of the door, 6 on that side. A total of 12 in this wing, a total of 12 in the other wing. 24 carried over to the back wings. A lawn and garden and an infant avenue, all ruled straight like a botanical account-book. Gas and ventilation, drainage and water service, all of the primest quality. Iron clamps and girders, fire-proof from top to bottom. Mechanical lifts for the housemaids, with all their brushes and brooms. Everything that heart could desire. Everything? Well, I suppose so. The little Gradgrinds had cabinets in various departments of science, too. They had a little conchological cabinet, and a little metallurgical cabinet, and a little mineralogical cabinet, and the specimens were all arranged and labelled, and the bits of stone and ore looked as though they might have been broken from the parent substances by those tremendously hard instruments, their own names, and, to paraphrase the idle legend of Peter Piper, who had never found his way into their nursery, if the greedy little Gradgrinds grasped at more than this, what was it, for good gracious goodness' sake, that the greedy little Gradgrinds grasped at? Their father walked on in a hopeful and satisfied frame of mind. He was an affectionate father, after his manner. but he probably would have described himself, if he had been put, like Sissy Jupe, upon a definition, as an eminently practical father. He had a particular pride in the phrase eminently practical, which was considered to have a special application to him. Whatsoever the public meeting held in Coketown, and whatsoever the subject of such meeting, some Coketowner was sure to seize the occasion of alluding to his eminently practical friend Gradgrind. This always pleased the eminently practical friend. He knew it to be his due, but his due was acceptable. He had reached the neutral ground upon the outskirts of the town, which was neither town nor country, and yet was either spoiled, when his ears were invaded by the sound of music. The clashing and banging band attached to the horse-riding establishment, which had there set up its rest in a wooden pavilion, was in full bray. A flag, floating from the summit of the temple, proclaimed to mankind that it was Sleary's horse-riding which claimed their suffrages. Sleary himself, a stout modern statue with a money-box at his elbow, in an ecclesiastical niche of early Gothic architecture, took the money. Miss Josephine Sleary, as some very long and very narrow strips of printed bill announced, was then inaugurating the entertainments with her graceful equestrian Tyrolean flower act. Among the other pleasing, but always strictly moral wonders, which must be seen to be believed, Signor Jupe was that afternoon to elucidate the diverting accomplishments of his highly trained performing dog Merrylegs. He was also to exhibit his astounding feat of throwing 75 hundredweight in rapid succession back-handed over his head, thus forming a fountain of solid iron in mid-air, a feat never before attempted in this or any other country, and which, having elicited some rapturous plaudits from enthusiastic throngs, it cannot be withdrawn. The same Signor Jupe was to enliven the varied performances at frequent intervals with his chaste Shakespearian quips and retorts. Lastly, he was to wind them up by appearing in his favourite character of Mr. William Button, of Tooley Street, in the highly novel and laughable hippocomedietta of the Tailor's Journey to Brentford. Thomas Gradgrind took no heed of these trivialities, of course, but passed on as a practical man ought to pass on, either brushing the noisy insects from his thoughts, or consigning them to the house of correction. But the turning of the road took him by the back of the booth, and at the back of the booth a number of children were congregated, in a number of stealthy attitudes, striving to peep in at the hidden glories of the place. This brought him to a stop.
"Now to think of these vagabonds,"
said he,
"attracting the young rabble from a model school."
A space of stunted grass and dry rubbish being between him and the young rabble, he took his eye-glass out of his waistcoat to look for any child he knew by name, and might order off. Phenomenon almost incredible, though distinctly seen, what did he then behold but his own metallurgical Louisa, peeping with all her might through a hole in a deal-board, and his own mathematical Thomas abasing himself on the ground to catch but a hoof of the graceful equestrian Tyrolean flower act. Dumb with amazement, Mr. Gradgrind crossed to the spot where his family was thus disgraced, laid his hand upon each erring child, and said,
"Louisa! Thomas!"
Both rose, red and disconcerted. But Louisa looked at her father with more boldness than Thomas did. Indeed, Thomas did not look at him, but gave himself up to be taken home like a machine.
"In the name of wonder, idleness, and folly,"
said Mr. Gradgrind, leading each way by a hand,
"what do you do here?"
"Wanted to see what it was like,"
returned Louisa, shortly.
"What it was like?"
"Yes, father."
There was an air of jaded sullenness in them both, and particularly in the girl. Yet, struggling through the dissatisfaction of her face, There was a light with nothing to rest upon, a fire with nothing to burn, a starved imagination keeping life in itself somehow, which brightened its expression, not with the brightness natural to cheerful youth, but with uncertain, eager, doubtful flashes, analogous to the changes on a blind face groping its way. She was a child now of 15 or 16, but at no distant day would seem to become a woman all at once. Her father thought so as he looked at her. She was pretty, would have been self-willed, he thought in his eminently practical way, but for her bringing up.
Thomas, though I have the fact before me, I find it difficult to believe you, with your education and resources, should have brought your sister to a scene like this.
I brought him, father,
said Louisa quickly.
I asked him to come.
I am sorry to hear it. I am very sorry indeed to hear it. It makes Thomas no better than it makes you worse, Louisa.
She looked at her father again, but no tear fell down her cheek.
You, Thomas, and you, to whom the circle of the sciences is open. Thomas and you, who may be said to be replete with facts. Thomas and you, who have been trained to mathematical exactness. Thomas and you, here,
cried Mr. Gradgrind,
in this degraded position. I am amazed.
I was tired, father. I have been tired a long time,
said Louisa.
Tired? Of what?
asked the astonished father.
I don't know of what. Of everything, I think.
Say not another word,
returned Mr. Gradgrind.
You are childish. I will hear no more.
He did not speak again until they had walked some half a mile in silence, when he gravely broke out with,
What would your best friends say, Louisa? Do you attach no value to their good opinion? What would Mr. Bounderby say?
At the mention of this name his daughter stole a look at him remarkable for its intense and searching character. He saw nothing of it, for before he looked at her she had again cast down her eyes.
What,
he repeated presently,
would Mr. Bounderby say?
All the way to Stone Lodge, as with grave indignation he led the two delinquents home, he repeated at intervals,
What would Mr. Bounderby say?
As if Mr. Bounderby had been Mrs. Grundy. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Hard Times by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times by Charles Dickens. Chapter 4. Mr. Bounderby. Not being Mrs. Grundy, who was Mr. Bounderby? Why, Mr. Bounderby was as near being Mr. Gradgrind's bosom friend as a man perfectly devoid of sentiment can approach that spiritual relationship towards another man perfectly devoid of sentiment. So near was Mr. Bounderby, or, if the reader should prefer it, so far off. He was a rich man, banker, merchant, manufacturer, and what not. A big, loud man, with a stare and a metallic laugh. A man made out of a coarse material, which seemed to have been stretched to make so much of him. A man with a great puffed head and forehead, swelled veins in his temples, and such a strained skin to his face that it seemed to hold his eyes open and lift his eyebrows up. A man with a pervading appearance on him of being inflated like a balloon, and ready to start. A man who could never sufficiently vaunt himself as a self-made man. A man who was always proclaiming, through that brassy speaking trumpet of a voice of his old ignorance and his old poverty. A man who was the bully of humility. A year or two younger than his eminently practical friend, Mr. Bounderby looked older, his 7 or 8 and 40, might have had the 7 or 8 added to it again without surprising anybody. He had not much hair. One might have fancied he had talked it off, and that what was left, all standing up in disorder, was in that condition from being constantly blown about by his windy boastfulness. In the formal drawing-room of Stone Lodge, standing on the hearth-rug, warming himself before the fire, Mr. Bounderby delivered some observations to Mrs. Gradgrind on the circumstance of it being his birthday. He stood before the fire, partly because it was a cool spring afternoon, though the sun shone, partly because the shade of Stone Lodge was always haunted by the ghost of damp mortar, partly because he thus took up a commanding position from which to subdue Mrs. Gradgrind.
I hadn't a shoe to my foot. As to a stocking, I didn't know such a thing by name. I passed the day in a ditch and the night in a pigsty. That's the way I spent my 10th birthday. Not that a ditch was new to me, for I was born in a ditch.
Mrs. Gradgrind, a little thin, white, pink-eyed bundle of shawls, of surpassing feebleness, mental and bodily, who was always taking physic without any effect, whenever she showed a symptom of coming to life, was invariably stunned by some weighty piece of fact tumbling on her. Mrs. Gradgrind hoped it was a dry ditch.
No, as wet as a sop, a foot of water in it,
said Mr. Bounderby.
Enough to give a baby a cold.
Mrs. Gradgrind considered.
Cold? I was born with inflammation of the lungs, and of everything else, I believe, that was capable of inflammation,
returned Mr. Bounderby.
For years, ma'am, I was one of the most miserable little wretches ever seen. I was so sickly that I was always moaning and groaning. I was so ragged and dirty that you wouldn't have touched me with a pair of tongs.
Mrs. Gradgrind faintly looked at the tongs, as the most appropriate thing her imbecility could think of doing.
How I fought through it, I don't know,
said Bounderby.
I was determined, I suppose. I've been a determined character in later life, and I suppose I was then. Here I am, Mrs. Gradgrind, anyhow, and nobody to thank for my being here but myself.
Mrs. Gradgrind meekly and weakly hoped that his mother—
My mother? Bolted, ma'am,
said Bounderby. Mrs. Gradgrind, stunned as usual, collapsed and gave it up.
My mother left me to my grandmother,
said Bounderby.
And according to the best of my remembrance, my grandmother was the wickedest and worst old woman that ever lived. If I got a little pair of shoes by any chance, she'd take 'em off and sell 'em for drink. Why, I've known that grandmother of mine lie in her bed and drink her 14 glasses of liquor before breakfast.
Mrs. Gradgrind, weakly smiling, and giving no other sign of vitality, looked, as she always did, like an indifferently executed transparency of a small female figure, without enough light behind it.
She kept a chandler's shop,
pursued Bounderby,
and kept me in an egg-box. That was the cot of my infancy, an old egg-box. As soon as I was big enough to run away, of course I ran away. Then I became a young vagabond, and instead of one old woman knocking me about and starving me, everybody of all ages knocked me about and starved me. They were right. They had no business to do anything else. I was a nuisance, an encumbrance, and a pest, and know that very well.
His pride in having at any time of his life achieved such a great social distinction as to be a nuisance, an encumbrance, and a pest, was only to be satisfied by 3 sonorous repetitions of the boast.
I was to pull through it, I suppose, Mrs. Gradgrind. Whether I was to do it or not, ma'am, I did it. I pulled through it, though nobody threw me a rope. Vagabond, errand-boy, vagabond, labourer, porter, clerk, chief manager, small partner, Josiah Bounderby of Coketown. Those are the antecedents and the culmination. Josiah Bounderby of Coketown. Learnt his letters from the outsides of shops, Mrs. Gradgrind, and was first able to tell the time upon a dial plate from studying the steeple clock of St. Giles Church, London, under the direction of a drunken cripple who was a convicted thief and an incorrigible vagrant. Tell Josiah Bounderby of Coketown of your district schools, and your model schools, and your training schools, and your whole kettle of fish schools, and Josiah Bounderby of Coketown tells you plainly, all right, all correct, he hadn't such advantages. But let us have hard-headed, solid-fisted people. The education that made him won't do for everybody, he knows well. Such and such his education was, however, and you may force him to swallow boiling fat, but you shall never force him to suppress the facts of his life.
Being heated when he arrived at this climax, Josiah Bounderby of Coketown stopped. He stopped just as his eminently practical friend, still accompanied by the two young culprits, entered the room. His eminently practical friend, on seeing him, stopped also, and gave Louisa a reproachful look that plainly said,
"Behold your Bounderby."
"Well?"
blustered Mr. Bounderby.
"What's the matter? What's young Thomas in the dumps about?"
He spoke of young Thomas, but he looked at Louisa.
"We were peeping at the circus,"
muttered Louisa, haughtily, without lifting up her eyes.
"and father caught us."
"And Mrs. Gradgrind,"
said her husband in a lofty manner.
"I should as soon have expected to find my children reading poetry."
"Dear me,"
whimpered Mrs. Gradgrind.
"How can you, Louisa and Thomas? I wonder at you. I declare you're enough to make one regret ever having had a family at all. I have a great mind to say I wish I hadn't. Then what would you have done, I should like to know?"
Mr. Gradgrind did not seem favourably impressed by these cogent remarks. He frowned impatiently.
"As if, with my head in its present throbbing state, you couldn't go and look at the shells and minerals and things provided for you, instead of circuses,"
said Mrs. Gradgrind.
"You know as well as I do, no young people have circus masters, or keep circuses in cabinets, or attend lectures about circuses. What can you possibly want to know of circuses, then? I am sure you have enough to do, if that's what you want. With my head in its present state, I couldn't remember the mere names of half the facts you have got to attend to."
"That's the reason,"
pouted Louisa.
"Don't tell me that's the reason, because it can't be nothing of the sort,"
said Mrs. Gradgrind.
"Go and be something illogical directly."
Mrs. Gradgrind was not a scientific character, and usually dismissed her children to their studies with this general injunction to choose their pursuits. In truth, Mrs. Gradgrind's stock of facts in general was woefully defective. But Mr. Gradgrind, in raising her to her high matrimonial position, had been influenced by two reasons. Firstly, she was most satisfactory as a question of figures, and secondly, she had no nonsense about her. By nonsense he meant fancy, and truly it is probable she was as free from any alloy of that nature as any human being not arrived at the perfection of an absolute idiot ever was. The simple circumstance of being left alone with her husband and Mr. Bounderby was sufficient to stun this admirable lady again without collision between herself and any other fact. So she once more died away, and nobody minded her.
"Bounderby,"
said Mr. Gradgrind, drawing a chair to the fireside,
"you were always so interested in my young people, particularly in Louisa, that I make no apology for saying to you I am very much vexed by this discovery. I have systematically devoted myself, as you know, to the education of the reason of my family. The reason is, as you know, the only faculty to which education should be addressed. And yet, Bounderby, it would appear from this unexpected circumstance of to-day, though in itself a trifling one, as if something had crept into Thomas's and Louisa's minds, which is, or rather which is not, I do not know that I can express myself better than by saying, which has never been intended to be developed, and in which their reason has no part.
There certainly is no reason for looking with interest at a parcel of vagabonds,
returned Bounderby.
When I was a vagabond myself, nobody looked with any interest at me, I know that.
Then comes the question,
said the eminently practical father, with his eyes on the fire.
In what has this vulgar curiosity its rise?
I'll tell you in what. In idle imagination.
I hope not,
said the eminently practical.
I confess, however, that the misgiving has crossed me on my way home.
In idle imagination, Gradgrind,
repeated Bounderby.
A very bad thing for anybody, but a cursed bad thing for a girl like Louisa. I should ask Mrs. Gradgrind's pardon for strong expression, but that she knows very well I am not a refined character. Whoever expects refinement in me will be disappointed. I hadn't a refined bringing up.
Whether,
said Gradgrind, pondering with his hands in his pockets and his cavernous eyes on the fire.
Whether any instructor or servant can have suggested anything? Whether Louisa or Thomas can have been reading anything? Whether, in spite of all precautions, an idle story-book can have got into the house? Because in minds that have been practically formed by rule and line from the cradle upwards, this is so curious, so incomprehensible.
Stop a bit,
cried Bounderby, who all this time had been standing, as before, on the hearth, bursting at the very furniture of the room with explosive humility.
You have one of those strollers' children in the school.
Cecilia Jupe by name,
said Mr. Gradgrind, with something of a stricken look at his friend.
Now, stop a bit,
cried Bounderby again.
How did she come here?
Why, the fact is, I saw the girl myself for the first time, only just now. She specially applied here at the house to be admitted, as not regularly belonging to our town, and, yes, you are right, Bounderby, you are right.
Now, stop a bit,
cried Bounderby once more.
Louisa saw her when she came?
Louisa certainly did see her, for she mentioned the application to me. But Louisa saw her, I have no doubt, in Mrs. Gradgrind's presence.
Pray, Mrs. Gradgrind,
said Bounderby,
what passed?
Oh, my poor health,
returned Mrs. Gradgrind.
The girl wanted to come to the school, and Mr. Gradgrind wanted girls to come to the school, and Louisa and Thomas both said that the girl wanted to come, and that Mr. Gradgrind wanted girls to come, and how was it possible to contradict them when such was the fact?
Now, I'll tell you what, Gradgrind,
said Mr. Bounderby.
Turn this girl to the right about, and there's an end of it.
I am much of your opinion.
Do it at once,
said Bounderby.
Has always been my motto from a child. When I thought I would run away from my egg-box and my grandmother, I did it at once. Do you the same. Do this at once.
Are you walking?
asked his friend.
I have the father's address. Perhaps you would not mind walking to town with me.
Not the least in the world,
said Mr. Bounderby.
As long as you do it at once.
So Mr. Bounderby threw on his hat. He always threw it on, as expressing a man who had been far too busily employed in making himself to acquire any fashion of wearing his hat, and with his hands in his pockets sauntered out into the hall.
I never wear gloves,
it was his custom to say.
I didn't climb up the ladder in them. Shouldn't be so high up if I had.
Being left to saunter in the hall a minute or two, while Mr. Gradgrind went upstairs for the address, he opened the door of the children's study, and looked into that serene, floor-clothed apartment, which, notwithstanding its bookcases and its cabinets, and its variety of learned and philosophical appliances, had much the genial aspect of a room devoted to hair-cutting. Louisa languidly leaned upon the window looking out, without looking at anything, while young Thomas stood sniffing revengefully at the fire. Adam Smith and Malthus, two younger Gradgrinds, were out at lecture in custody, and little Jane, after manufacturing a good deal of moist pipe-clay on her face with slate pencil and tears, had fallen asleep over vulgar fractions.
"It's all right now, Louisa. It's all right, young Thomas,"
said Mr. Bounderby.
"You won't do so any more. I'll answer for it being all over with father. Well, Louisa, that's worth a kiss, isn't it?"
You can take one, Mr. Bounderby,
returned Louisa, when she had coldly paused, and slowly walked across the room, and ungraciously raised her cheek towards him, with her face turned away.
"Always my pet, ain't you, Louisa?"
said Mr. Bounderby.
"Good-bye, Louisa."
He went his way, but she stood on the same spot, rubbing the cheek he had kissed with her handkerchief until it was burning red. She was still doing this 5 minutes afterwards.
"What are you about, Lou?"
her brother sulkily remonstrated.
"You'll rub a hole in your face."
You may cut the piece out with your penknife if you like, Tom. I wouldn't cry.
End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Hard Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times by Charles Dickens. Chapter 5. The Keynote. Coketown, to which Messrs. Bounderby and Gradgrind now walked, was a triumph of fact. It had no greater taint of fancy in it than Mrs. Gradgrind herself. Let us strike the keynote, Coketown, before pursuing our tune. It was a town of red brick, or of brick that would have been red if the smoke and ashes had allowed it. But, as matters stood, it was a town of unnatural red and black, like the painted face of a savage. It was a town of machinery and tall chimneys, out of which interminable serpents of smoke trailed themselves for ever and ever, and never got uncoiled. It had a black canal in it, and a river that ran purple with ill-smelling dye, and vast piles of building full of windows, where there was a rattling and a trembling all day long, and where the piston of the steam-engine worked monotonously up and down like the head of an elephant in a state of melancholy madness. It contained several large streets, all very like one another, and many small streets still more like one another, inhabited by people equally like one another, who all went in and out at the same hours, with the same sound, upon the same pavements, to do the same work, and to whom every day was the same as yesterday and to-morrow, and every year the counterpart of the last and the next. These attributes of Coketown were in the main inseparable from the work by which it was sustained. Against them were to be set off comforts of life which found their way all over the world, and elegancies of life which made, we will not ask how much, of the fine lady who could scarcely bear to hear the place mentioned. The rest of its features were voluntary, and they were these. You saw nothing in Coketown but was severely workful. If the members of a religious persuasion built a chapel there, as the members of 18 religious persuasions had done, they made it a pious warehouse of red brick, with sometimes, but this is only in highly ornamental examples, a bell in a bird-cage on the top of it. The solitary exception was the new church, a stuccoed edifice with a square steeple over the door, terminating in 4 short pinnacles like florid wooden legs. All the public inscriptions in the town were painted alike, in severe characters of black and white. The jail might have been the infirmary might have been the jail, the town hall might have been either, or both, or anything else, for anything that appeared to the contrary in the graces of their construction. Fact, 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 everywhere in the material aspect of the town. Fact, 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 everywhere in the immaterial. The McChokum Child School was all fact, and the School of Design was all fact, and the relations between master and man were all fact, and everything was fact between the lying-in hospital and the cemetery, and what you couldn't state in figures, or show to be purchasable in the cheapest market and saleable in the dearest, was not, and never should be. World without end. Amen. A town so sacred in fact, and so triumphant in its assertion, of course got on well. Why, no, not quite well. No, dear me. No, Coketown did not come out of its own furnaces in all respects like gold that had stood the fire. First, the perplexing mystery of the place was, who belonged to the 18 denominations, because whoever did, the labouring people did not. It was very strange to walk through the streets on a Sunday morning, and note how few of them the barbarous jangling of bells that was driving the sick and nervous mad called away from their own quarter, from their own close rooms, from the corners of their own streets, where they lounged listlessly, gazing at all the church and chapel going, as at a thing with which they had no manner of concern. Nor was it merely the stranger who noticed this, because there was a native organization in Coketown itself, whose members were to be heard in the House of Commons every session, indignantly petitioning for Acts of Parliament that should make these people religious by main force. Then came the Teetotal Society, who complained that these same people would get drunk, and showed in tabular statements that they did get drunk, and proved at tea-parties that no inducement, human or divine, except a medal, would induce them to forego their custom of getting drunk. Then came the chemist and the druggist, with other tabular statements, showing that when they didn't get drunk they took opium. Then came the experienced chaplain of the jail, with more tabular statements, outdoing all the previous tabular statements, and showing that the same people would resort to low haunts, hidden from the public eye, where they heard low singing and saw low dancing, and mayhap joined in it, and where A.B., aged 24 next birthday, and committed for 18 months solitary, had himself said, not that he had ever shown himself particularly worthy of belief, his ruin began, as he was perfectly sure and confident that otherwise he would have been a tip-top moral specimen. Then came Mr. Gradgrind and Mr. Bounderby, the two gentlemen at this present moment walking through Coketown, and both eminently practical, who could, on occasion, furnish more tabular statements, derived from their own personal experience, and illustrated by cases they had known and seen, from which it clearly appeared, in short, it was the only clear thing in the case, that these same people were a bad lot altogether, gentlemen, that do what you would for them, they were never thankful for it, gentlemen, that they were restless, gentlemen, and that they never knew what they wanted, that they lived upon the best, and bought fresh butter, and insisted on mocha coffee, and rejected all but prime parts of meat, and yet were internally dissatisfied and unmanageable. In short, it was the moral of the old nursery fable, there was an old woman, and what do you think? She lived upon nothing but victuals and drink. Victuals and drink were the whole of her diet, and yet this old woman would never be quiet. Is it possible, I wonder, that there was an analogy between the case of the Coketown population and the case of the little Gradgrinds? Surely none of us, in our sober senses, and acquainted with figures, are to be told at this time of day that one of the foremost elements in the existence of the Coketown working people had been for scores of years deliberately set at naught, that there was any fancy in them demanding to be brought into healthy existence instead of struggling on in convulsions, that exactly in the ratio as they worked long and monotonously, the craving grew within them for some physical relief, some relaxation, encouraging good humour and good spirits, and giving them a vent, some recognized holiday, though it were but for an honest dance to a stirring band of music, some occasional light pie in which even M'Choakumchild had no finger, which craving must and would be satisfied aright, or must and would inevitably go wrong until the laws of the creation were repealed.
This man lives at Pod's End, and I don't quite know Pod's End,
said Mr. Gradgrind.
Which is it, Bounderby?
Mr. Bounderby knew it was somewhere down-town, but knew no more respecting it. So they stopped for a moment, looking about. Almost as they did so, there came running round the corner of the street at a quick pace and with a frightened look, a girl whom Mr. Gradgrind recognized.
"Hello!" said he. "Stop! What are you doing? Stop!"
Girl number 20 stopped then, palpitating, and made him a curtsy.
"Why are you tearing about the streets?" said Mr. Gradgrind. "In this improper manner."
I was run after, sir.
The girl panted.
And I wanted to get away.
"Run after?"
repeated Mr. Gradgrind.
"Who would run after you?"
The question was unexpectedly and suddenly answered for her by the colourless boy Bitzer, who came round the corner with such blind speed, and so little anticipating a stoppage on the pavement, that he brought himself up against Mr. Gradgrind's waistcoat, and rebounded into the road.
"What do you mean, boy?"
said Mr. Gradgrind.
"What are you doing? How dare you dash against everybody in this manner?"
Bitzer picked up his cap, which the concussion had knocked off, and backing, and knuckling his forehead, pleaded that it was an accident.
"Was this boy running after you, Jupe?"
asked Mr. Gradgrind.
Yes, sir,
said the girl reluctantly.
No, I wasn't, sir,
cried Bitzer.
Not till she run away from me. But the horse riders never mind what they say, sir, they're famous for it. You know the horse riders are famous for never minding what they say.
Addressing Sissy.
It's as well known in the town as, please, sir, as the multiplication table isn't known to the horse riders.
Bitzer tried Mr. Bounderby with this.
He frightened me so,
said the girl.
With his cruel faces.
Oh!
cried Bitzer.
Oh, and you one of the rest. And you a horse rider. I never looked at her, sir. I asked her if she would know how to define a horse tomorrow, and offered to tell her again, and she ran away, and I ran after her, sir, that she might know how to answer when she was asked. You wouldn't have thought of saying such mischief if you hadn't been a horse rider.
Their calling seems to be pretty well known among 'em,
observed Mr. Bounderby.
You'd have had the whole school peeping in a row in a week.
"Truly, I think so,"
returned his friend.
"Bitzer, turn you about and take yourself home. Jupe, stay here a moment. Let me hear of your running in this manner any more, boy, and you will hear of me through the master of the school. You understand what I mean. Go along."
The boy stopped in his rapid blinking, knuckled his forehead again, glanced at Sissy, turned about, and retreated.
"Now, girl,"
said Mr. Gradgrind,
"take this gentleman and me to your father's. We are going there. What have you got in that bottle you are carrying?"
"Gin,"
said Mr. Bounderby.
Dear no, sir, it's the 9 oils.
"The what?"
cried Mr. Bounderby.
The 9 oils, sir, to rub father with.
"Then,"
said Mr. Bounderby, with a loud short laugh,
"what the devil do you rub your father with 9 oils for?"
It's what our people always use, sir, when they get any hurts in the ring,
replied the girl, looking over her shoulder to assure herself that her pursuer was gone.
They bruise themselves very bad sometimes.
"Serve 'em right,"
said Mr. Bounderby,
"for being idle."
She glanced up at his face, with mingled astonishment and dread.
"By George,"
said Mr. Bounderby,
"when I were 4 or 5 years younger than you, I had worse bruises upon me than 10 oils. 20 oils, 40 oils would have rubbed off. I didn't get 'em by posture making, but by being banged about. There was no rope dancing for me. I danced on the bare ground, and was larruped with the rope."
Mr. Gradgrind, though hard enough, was by no means so rough a man as Mr. Bounderby. His character was not unkind, all things considered. It might have been a very kind one indeed, if he had only made some round mistake in the arithmetic that balanced it, years ago. He said, in what he meant for a reassuring tone, as they turned down a narrow road,
"And this is Pod's End, is it, Jupe?"
This is it, sir, and, if you wouldn't mind, sir, this is the house.
She stopped at twilight at the door of a mean little public-house, with dim red lights in it, as haggard and shabby as if, for want of custom, it had itself taken to drinking, and had gone the way all drunkards go, and was very near the end of it.
It's only crossing the bar, sir, and up the stairs, if you wouldn't mind, and waiting there for a moment till I get a candle. If you should hear a dog, sir, it's only Merrylegs, and he only barks."
"Merrylegs and 9 oils, eh?"
said Mr. Bounderby, entering last with his metallic laugh.
"Pretty well this for a self-made man."
End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Hard Times by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times by Charles Dickens. Chapter 6. Sleary's Horsemanship. The name of the public-house was Pegasus's Arms. The Pegasus's legs might have been more to the purpose, but underneath the winged horse upon the signboard, the Pegasus' Arms was inscribed in Roman letters. Beneath that inscription again, in a flowing scroll, the painter had touched off the lines, "Good malt makes good beer. Walk in, and they'll draw it here. Good wine makes good brandy. Give us a call, and you'll find it handy." Framed and glazed, upon the wall behind the dingy little bar, was another Pegasus, a theatrical one, with real gauze let in for his wings, golden stars stuck on all over him, and his ethereal harness made of red silk. As it had grown too dusky without to see the sign, and as it had not grown light enough within to see the picture, Mr. Gradgrind and Mr. Bounderby received no offence from these idealities. They followed the girl up some steep corner stairs without meeting any one, and stopped in the dark while she went on for a candle. They expected every moment to hear Merrylegs give tongue, but the highly trained performing dog had not barked when the girl and the candle appeared together.
"Father's not in our room, sir,"
she said, with a face of great surprise.
"If you wouldn't mind walking in, I'll find him directly."
They walked in, and Sissy, having set 2 chairs for them, sped away with a quick light step. It was a mean shabbily furnished room with a bed in it. The white nightcap, embellished with 2 peacock's feathers and a pigtail bolt upright, in which Signor Jupe had that very afternoon enlivened the varied performances with his chaste Shakespearian quips and retorts, hung upon a nail. But no other portion of his wardrobe, or other token of himself or his pursuits, was to be seen anywhere. As to Merrylegs, that respectable ancestor of the highly trained animal who went aboard the ark, might have been accidentally shut out of it for any sign of a dog that was manifest to eye or ear in the Pegasus's arms. They heard the doors of rooms above opening and shutting, as Sissy went from one to another in quest of her father, and presently they heard voices expressing surprise. She came bounding down again in a great hurry, opened a battered and mangy old hair-trunk, found it empty, and looked round with her hands clasped and her face full of terror.
"Father must have gone down to the booth, sir. I don't know why he should go there, but he must be there. I'll bring him in a minute."
She was gone directly, without her bonnet, with her long dark childish hair streaming behind her.
"What does she mean?"
said Mr. Gradgrind.
"Back in a minute? It's more than a mile off."
Before Mr. Bounderby could reply, a young man appeared at the door, and introducing himself with the words,
"By your leaves, gentlemen,"
walked in with his hands in his pockets. His face, close-shaven, thin, and sallow, was shaded by a great quantity of dark hair, brushed into a roll all round his head, and parted up the centre. His legs were very robust, but shorter than legs of good proportion should have been. His chest and back were as much too broad as his legs were too short. He was dressed in a Newmarket coat and tight-fitting trousers, wore a shawl round his neck, smelt of lamp-oil, straw, orange peel, horse's provender, and sawdust, and looked a most remarkable sort of centaur, compounded of the stable and the playhouse. Where the one began and the other ended, nobody could have told with any precision. This gentleman was mentioned in the bills of the day as Mr. E.W.B. Childers, so justly celebrated for his daring vaulting act as the wild huntsman of the North American prairies, in which popular performance a diminutive boy with an old face, who now accompanied him, assisted as his infant son, being carried upside down over his father's shoulder by one foot, and being held by the crown of his head heels upwards in the palm of his father's hand, according to the violent paternal manner in which wild huntsmen may be observed to fondle their offspring. Made up with curls, wreaths, wings, white bismuth, and carmine, this hopeful young person soared into so pleasing a Cupid as to constitute the chief delight of the maternal part of the spectators. But in private, where his characteristics were a precocious cutaway coat and an extremely gruff voice, he became of the turfy.
By your leaves, gentlemen,
said Mr. E.W.B. Childers, glancing round the room.
It was you, I believe, that were wishing to see Jupe.
It was,
said Mr. Gradgrind.
His daughter has gone to fetch him, but I can't wait. Therefore, if you please, I will leave a message for him with you.
You see, my friend,
Mr. Bounderby put in,
we're the kind of people who know the value of time, and you're the kind of people who don't know the value of time.
I have not,
retorted Mr. Childers, after surveying him from head to foot,
the honor of knowing you. But if you mean that you can make more money of your time than I can of mine, I should judge from your appearance that you are about right.
And when you have made it, you can keep it too, I should think,
said Cupid.
Kidderminster, stow that,
said Mr. Childers. Master Kidderminster was Cupid's mortal name.
What does he come here cheeking us for, then?
cried Mr. Kidderminster, showing a very irascible temperament.
If you want to cheek us, pay your ochre at the doors and take it out.
Kidderminster,
said Mr. Childers, raising his voice.
Stow that. Sir, I was addressing myself to you. You may or you may not be aware, for perhaps you have not been much in the audience, that Jupe has missed his tip very often lately.
Has? What has he missed?
asked Mr. Gradgrind, glancing at the potent Bounderby for assistance.
Missed his tip.
Offered at the garters 4 times last night, and never done 'em once,
said Master Kidderminster.
Missed his tip at the banners too, and was loose in his ponging.
Didn't do what he ought to do. Was short in his leaps, and bad in his tumbling.
Mr. Childers interpreted.
Oh,
said Mr. Gradgrind.
That is tip, is it?
In a general way, that's missed his tip,
Mr. E.W.B. Childers answered.
9 oils, merrylegs, missing tips, garters, banners, and ponging, eh? Ha!
ejaculated Bounderby, with his laugh of laughs.
Queer sort of company, too, for a man who has raised himself.
Lower yourself, then,
retorted Cupid.
Oh, Lord, if you've raised yourself so high as all that comes to, let yourself down a bit.
This is a very obtrusive lad,
said Mr. Gradgrind, turning and knitting his brows on him.
We'd have had a young gentleman to meet you if we'd have known you were coming,
retorted Mr. Kidderminster, nothing abashed.
It's a pity you don't have a bespeak, being so particular. You're on the tight Jeff, ain't you?
What does this unmannerly boy mean by tight Jeff?
There, get out,
said Mr. Childers, thrusting his young friend from the room, rather in the prairie manner.
Tight Jeff or slack Jeff, it don't much signify. It's only tight rope and slack rope. You were going to give me a message for Jupe?
Yes, it was.
Then?
continued Mr. Childers, quickly.
My opinion is, he will never receive it. Do you know much of him?
I never saw the man in my life.
I doubt if you ever will see him now. It's pretty plain to me he's off.
Do you mean that he has deserted his daughter?
Aye, I mean,
said Mr. Childers, with a nod,
that he has cut. He was goosed last night. He was goosed the night before last. He was goosed today. He has lately got in the way of being always goosed, and he can't stand it.
Why has he been so very much goosed?
asked Mr. Gradgrind, forcing the word out of himself with great solemnity and reluctance.
His joints are turning stiff, and he is getting used up,
said Childers.
He has his points as a cackler still, but he can't get a living out of them.
A cackler?
Bounderby repeated.
Here we go again.
A speaker, if the gentleman likes it better,
said Mr. E.W.B. Childers, superciliously throwing the interpretation over his shoulder, and accompanying it with a shake of his long hair, which all shook at once.
Now, it's a remarkable fact, sir, that it cut that man deeper to know that his daughter knew of his being goosed, than to go through with it.
Good,
interrupted Mr. Bounderby.
This is good, Gradgrind. A man so fond of his daughter that he runs away from her. This is devilish good. Now, I tell you what, young man, I haven't always occupied my present station of life. I know what these things are. You may be astonished to hear it, but my mother ran away from me.
E.W.B. Childers replied pointedly that he was not at all astonished to hear it.
Very well,
said Bounderby.
I was born in the ditch, and my mother ran away from me. Do I excuse her for it? No. Have I ever excused her for it? No. What do I call her for it? I call her probably the worst woman that ever lived in the world, except my drunken grandmother. There's no family pride about me, and there's no imaginative sentimental humbug about me. I call a spade, and I call the mother of Josiah Bounderby of Coketown, without any fear or favour, what I should call her if she'd been the mother of Dick Jones of Wapping. So with this man, he's a runaway rogue and a vagabond, that's what he is, in English.
It's all the same to me what he is or what he is not, whether in English or whether in French,
retorted Mr. E.W.B. Childers, facing about.
I am telling your friend what's the fact. If you don't like to hear it, you can avail yourself in the open air. You give it mouth enough, you do, but give it mouth in your own building at least,
remonstrated E.W.B. with stern irony.
Don't give it mouth in this building, till you're called upon. You have got some building of your own, I dare say now?
Perhaps so,
replied Mr. Bounderby, rattling his money and laughing.
Then give it mouth in your own building, will you, if you please? said
Childers.
Because this isn't a strong building, and too much of you might bring it down.
Eyeing Mr. Bounderby from head to foot again, he turned from him, as from a man finally disposed of, to Mr. Gradgrind.
Jupe sent his daughter out on an errand not an hour ago, and then was seen to slip out himself, with his hat over his eyes, and a bundle tied up in a handkerchief under his arm. So she will never believe it of him, but he has cut away and left her.
Pray,
said Mr. Gradgrind,
why will she never believe it of him?
Because those two were one, because they were never asunder, because up to this time he seemed to dote upon her,
said Childers, taking a step or two to look into the empty trunk. Both Mr. Childers and Master Kidderminster walked in a curious manner, with their legs wider apart than the general run of men, and with a very knowing assumption of being stiff in the knees. This walk was common to all the male members of the Sleary's company, and was understood to express that they were always on horseback.
Poor Sissy, he had better have apprenticed her,
said Childers, giving his hair another shake, as he looked up from the empty box.
Now he leaves her without anything to take to.
It is credible to you, who have never been apprenticed, to express that opinion,
returned Mr. Gradgrind approvingly.
I never apprenticed. I was apprenticed when I was 7 years old.
Oh, indeed?
said Mr. Gradgrind, rather resentfully, as having been defrauded of his good opinion.
I was not aware of its being the custom to apprentice young persons to
idleness.
Mr. Bounderby put in a loud laugh.
No, neither Lord Harry nor I.
Her father always had it in his head,
resumed Childers, feigning unconsciousness of Mr. Bounderby's existence,
that she was to be taught the deuce and all of education. How it got into his head, I can't say. I can only say that it never got out. He has been picking up a bit of reading for her, here, and a bit of writing for her, there, and a bit of ciphering for her, somewhere else, these 7 years.
Mr. E.W.B. Childers took one of his hands out of his pockets, stroked his face and chin, and looked, with a good deal of doubt and a little hope, at Mr. Gradgrind. From the first he had sought to conciliate that gentleman for the sake of the deserted girl.
When Sissy got into the school here,
he pursued,
her father was as pleased as Punch. I couldn't altogether make out why myself, as we were not stationary here, but being comers and goers anywhere. I suppose, however, he had this move in his mind. He was always half cracked, and then considered her provided for. If you should happen to have looked in here tonight for the purpose of telling him that you were going to do her any little service,
said Mr. Childers, stroking his face again and repeating his look,
it would be very fortunate and well timed. Very fortunate and well timed.
On the contrary,
returned Mr. Gradgrind,
I came to tell him that her connections made her not an object for the school, and that she must not attend any more. Still, if her father really has left her without any connivance on her part, Bounderby, let me have a word with you.
Upon this, Mr. Childers politely betook himself, with his equestrian walk, to the landing outside the door, and there stood stroking his face and softly whistling. While thus engaged, he overheard such phrases in Mr. Bounderby's voice as,
No, I say no, I advise you not. I say by no means.
While from Mr. Gradgrind he heard in his much lower tone the words,
But even as an example to Louisa of what this pursuit has been the subject of a vulgar curiosity leads and ends in. Think of it, Bounderby, in that point of view.
Meanwhile, the various members of Sleary's company gradually gathered together from the upper regions where they were quartered, and from standing about, talking in low voices to one another and to Mr. Childers, gradually insinuated themselves and him into the room. There were 2 or 3 handsome young women among them, with their 2 or 3 husbands, and their 2 or 3 mothers, and their 8 or 9 little children, who did the fairy business when required. The father of one of the families was in the habit of balancing the father of another of the families on the top of a great pole. The father of the third family often made a pyramid of both those fathers, with Master Kidderminster for the apex, and himself for the base. All the fathers could dance upon rolling casks, stand upon bottles, catch knives and balls, twirl hand-basins, ride upon anything, jump over everything, and stick at nothing. All the mothers could and did dance upon the slack wire and the tight-rope, and perform rapid acts on bare-backed steeds. None of them were at all particular in respect of showing their legs, and one of them, alone in a Greek chariot, drove 6 in hand into every town they came to. They all assumed to be mighty rakish and knowing. They were not very tidy in their private dresses, they were not at all orderly in their domestic arrangements, and the combined literature of the whole company would have produced but a poor letter on any subject. Yet there was a remarkable gentleness and childishness about these people, a special inaptitude for any kind of sharp practice, and an untiring readiness to help and pity one another, deserving often of as much respect, and always of as much generous construction, as the everyday virtues of any class of people in the world. Last of all appeared Mr. Sleary, a stout man, as already mentioned, with one fixed eye and one loose eye, a voice, if it can be called so, like the efforts of a broken old pair of bellows, a flabby surface, and a muddled head which was never sober and never drunk.
"Squire,"
said Mr. Sleary, who was troubled with asthma, and whose breath came far too thick and heavy for the letter S.
Your servant. This is a bad piece of business, this is. You heard of my clown and his dog being supposed to have molested?
He addressed Mr. Gradgrind, who answered,
Yes.
Well, squire,
he returned, taking off his hat, and rubbing the lining with his pocket-handkerchief, which he kept inside for the purpose.
Is it your intention to do anything for the poor girl, squire?
I shall have something to propose to her when she comes back,
said Mr. Gradgrind.
Glad to hear it, squire. Not that I want to get rid of the child, any more than I want to stand in her way. I'm willing to take her apprentice, though at her age is late. My voice is a little husky, squire, and not easily heard by them as don't know me. But if you'd been chilled and heated and chilled and heated in the ring when you was young, as often as I have been, your voice wouldn't have lasted out, squire, no more than mine.
I dare say not,
said Mr. Gradgrind.
What shall it be, squire, while you wait? Shall it be sherry? Give it a name, squire,
said Mr. Sleary, with hospitable ease.
Nothing for me, I thank you,
said Mr. Gradgrind.
Don't say nothing, squire. What doth your friend say? If you haven't took your feed yet, have a glass of bitters.
Here his daughter Josephine, a pretty fair-haired girl of 18, who had been tied on a horse at 2 years old, and had made a will at 12, which she always carried about with her, expressive of her dying desire to be drawn to the grave by the 2 piebald ponies, cried,
Father, hush, she has come back.
Then came Sissy Jupe, running into the room as she had run out of it, and when she saw them all assembled, and saw their looks, and saw no father there, she broke into the most deplorable cry, and took refuge on the bosom of the most accomplished tight-rope lady, herself in the family way, who knelt down on the floor to nurse her and to weep over her.
It's an internal shame upon my soul, it is,
said Sleary.
Oh, my dear father, my good, kind father, where are you gone? You are gone to try to do me some good, I know. You are gone away for my sake, I am sure, and how miserable and helpless you will be without me, poor, poor father, until you come back.
And it was so pathetic to hear her saying many things of this kind, with her face turned upward, and her arms stretched out as if she were trying to stop this departing shadow and embrace it, that no one spoke a word, until Mr. Bounderby, growing impatient, took the case in hand.
Now, good people all,
said he,
this is a wanton waste of time. Let the girl understand the fact. Let her take it from me, if you like, who have been run away from myself. Here, what's your name? Your father has absconded, deserted you, and you mustn't expect to see him again as long as you live.
They cared so little for plain fact, these people, and were in that advanced state of degeneracy on the subject, that instead of being impressed by the speaker's strong common sense, they took it in extraordinary dudgeon. The men uttered "Shame!" and the women "Brute!" and Sleary, in some haste, communicated the following hints, apart to Mr. Bounderby.
I tell you what, squire, to speak plain to you, my opinion is that you had better cut it short and drop it. They're very good-natured people, my people, but they're accustomed to be quick in their movements, and if you don't act upon my advice, I'm damned if I don't believe they'll piss you out of winder.
Mr. Bounderby being restrained by this mild suggestion, Mr. Gradgrind found an opening for his eminently practical exposition of the subject.
It is of no moment,
said he,
whether this person is to be expected back at any time, or the contrary. He has gone away, and there is no present expectation of his return. That, I believe, is agreed on all hands.
That's agreed, squire. Stick to that.
Well, then, I, who came here to inform the father of the poor girl Jupe that she could not be received at the school any more, in consequence of there being practical objections into which I need not enter, to the reception there of the children of persons so employed, am prepared in these altered circumstances to make a proposal. I am willing to take charge of you, Jupe, and to educate you, and to provide for you. The only condition, over and above your good behavior, I make is that you decide now, at once, whether to accompany me or to remain here. Also, that if you accompany me now, it is understood that you communicate no more with any of your friends who are here present. These observations compromise the whole of the case.
At the same time,
said Sleary,
I must put in my word, Squire, though that both sides of the banner may be equally seen, if you like. Cecilia, to be prenticed, you know, the nature of the work, and you know your companions, Emma Gordon, in whose lap you're lying at present, would be a mother to you, and Josephine would be a sister to you. I don't pretend to be of the angel breed myself, and I don't say but what when you missed your tip, you'd find me cut up rough, and swear an oath or two at you. But what I say, Squire, is that, good-tempered or bad-tempered, I never did a horse an injury yet, no more than swearing at him went, and that I don't expect it shall begin otherwise at my time of life, with a rider. I never was much of a cackler, Squire, and I have said my say.
The latter part of this speech was addressed to Mr. Gradgrind, who received it with a grave inclination of his head, and then remarked,
The only observation I will make to you, Jupe, in the way of influencing your decision, is that it is highly desirable to have a sound practical education, and that even your father himself, from what I understand, appears on your behalf to have known and felt that much.
The last words had a visible effect upon her. She stopped in her wild crying, a little detached herself from Emma Gordon, and turned her face full upon her patron. The whole company perceived the force of the change, and drew a long breath together that plainly said, She will go.
Be sure you know your own mind, Jupe,
Mr. Gradgrind counselled her.
I say no more. Be sure you know your own mind.
When father comes back,
cried the girl, bursting into tears again after a minute's silence.
How will he ever find me if I go away?
You may be quite at ease,
said Mr. Gradgrind, calmly. He worked out the whole matter like a sum.
You may be quite at ease, Jupe, on that score, and in such a case your father, I apprehend, must find out Mr.
Sleary. That's my name, Squire. Not ashamed of it, known all over England, and always pays its way.
Must find out Mr. Sleary, who would then let him know where you went. I should have no power of keeping you against his wish, and he would have no difficulty at any time in finding Mr. Thomas Gradgrind of Coketown. I am well known.
Well known,
assented Mr. Sleary, rolling his loose eye.
You're one of the sort, Squire, that keeps a precious sight of money out of the house, but never mind that at present.
There was another silence, and then she exclaimed, sobbing with her hands before her face,
Oh, give me my clothes, and let me go away before I break my heart.
The women sadly bestirred themselves to get the clothes together. It was soon done, for there were not many, and to pack them in a basket which had often travelled with them. Sissy sat all the time upon the ground, still sobbing and covering her eyes. Mr. Gradgrind and his friend Bounderby stood near the door, ready to take her away. Mr. Sleary stood in the middle of the room, with the male members of the company about him, exactly as he would have stood in the centre of the ring during his daughter Josephine's performance. He wanted nothing but his whip. The basket packed in silence, they brought her bonnet to her, and smoothed her disordered hair, and put it on. Then they pressed about her, and bent over her in very natural attitudes, kissing and embracing her, and brought the children to take leave of her, and were a tender-hearted, simple, foolish set of women altogether.
"Now, Jupe,"
said Mr. Gradgrind,
"if you are quite determined, come."
But she had to take her farewell of the male part of the company yet, and every one of them had to unfold his arms, for they all assumed the professional attitude when they found themselves near Sleary, and gave her a parting kiss, Master Kidderminster excepted, in whose young nature there was an original flavour of the misanthrope, who was also known to have harboured matrimonial views, and who moodily withdrew. Mr. Sleary was reserved until the last. Opening his arms wide, he took her by both her hands, and would have sprung her up and down, after the riding-master manner of congratulating young ladies on their dismounting from a rapid act, but there was no rebound in Sissy, and she only stood before him crying.
"Good-bye, my dear,"
said Sleary.
"You'll make your fortune, I hope, and none of our poor folks will ever trouble you, I'll pound it. I wish your father hadn't taken his dog with him. It's a ill convenience to have the dog out of the bilth. But on second thought, he wouldn't have performed without his master, though it's as broad as it's long."
With that he regarded her attentively with his fixed eye, surveyed his company with his loose one, kissed her, shook his head, and handed her to Mr. Gradgrind as to a horse.
"There she is, Squire,"
he said, sweeping her with a professional glance as if she were being adjusted in her seat.
"And she'll do you justice. Good-bye, Cecilia."
"Good-bye, Cecilia."
"Good-bye, Sissy."
God bless you, dear,"
in a variety of voices from all the room. But the riding-master eye had observed the bottle of the 9 oils in her bosom, and he now interposed with,
"Leave the bottle, my dear. It's large to carry. It will be of no use to you now. Give it to me."
"No, no,"
she said, in another burst of tears.
"Oh, no, pray let me keep it for father till he comes back. He will want it when he comes back. He had never thought of going away when he sent me for it. I must keep it for him, if you please."
"So be it, my dear. You see how it is, Squire. Farewell, Cecilia. My last words to you is this. Stick to the terms of your engagement. Be obedient to the Squire, and forget us. But if when you're grown up and married and well off you come upon any horse-riding ever, don't be hard upon it. Don't be cross with it. Give it a bespeak if you can, and think you might do worse. People must be amused, Squire, somehow,"
continued Sleary, rendered more pursy than ever by so much talking.
"They can't be always a-working, nor yet they can't be always a-learning. Make the best of us, not the worst. I've got my living out of the horse-riding all my life, I know, but I consider that I lay down the philosophy of the subject when I say to you, Squire, make the best of us, not the worst."
The Sleary philosophy was propounded as they went downstairs, and the fixed eye of philosophy, and its rolling eye too, soon lost the 3 figures and the basket in the darkness of the street. Chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 7. Mrs. Sparsit. Mr. Bounderby being a bachelor, an elderly lady presided over his establishment in consideration of a certain annual stipend. Mrs. Sparsit was this lady's name, and she was a prominent figure in attendance on Mr. Bounderby's car, as it rolled along in triumph with the Bully of Humility inside. For Mrs. Sparsit had not only seen different days, but was highly connected. She had a great aunt living in these very times, called Lady Scadgers. Mr. Sparsit, deceased, of whom she was the relict, had been by the mother's side what Mrs. Sparsit still called a Powler. Strangers of limited information and dull apprehension were sometimes observed not to know what a Powler was, and even to appear uncertain whether it might be a business, or a political party, or a profession of faith. The better class of minds, however, did not need to be informed that the Powlers were an ancient stock, who could trace themselves so exceedingly far back that it was not surprising if they sometimes lost themselves, which they had rather frequently done, as respected horseflesh, blind hookey, Hebrew monetary transactions, and the insolvent debtors' court. The late Mr. Sparsit, being by the mother's side a Powler, married this lady, being by the father's side a Scadgers. Lady Scadgers, an immensely fat old woman, with an inordinate appetite for butcher's meat, and a mysterious leg which now refused to get out of bed for 14 years, contrived the marriage at a period when Sparsit was just of age, and chiefly noticeable for a slender body, weakly supported on 2 long slim props, and surmounted by no head worth mentioning. He inherited a fair fortune from his uncle, but owed it all before he came into it, and spent it twice over immediately afterwards. Thus, when he died, at 24, the scene of his decease Calais, and the cause brandy, he did not leave his widow, from whom he had been separated soon after the honeymoon, in affluent circumstances. That bereaved lady, 15 years older than he, fell presently at deadly feud with her own relative, Lady Scadgers, and, partly to spite her ladyship, and partly to maintain herself, went out at a salary. And here she was now, in her elderly days, with the Coriolanian style of nose and the dense black eyebrows which had captivated Sparsit, making Mr. Bounderby's tea as he took his breakfast. If Bounderby had been a conqueror, and Mrs. Sparsit a captive princess whom he took about as a feature in his state processions, he could not have made a greater flourish with her than he habitually did, just as it belonged to his boastfulness to depreciate his own extraction, so it belonged to it to exalt Mrs. Sparsit's, in the measure that he would not allow his own youth to have been attended by a single favourable circumstance. He brightened Mrs. Sparsit's juvenile career with every possible advantage, and showered waggon-loads of early roses all over that lady's path.
"And yet, sir,"
he would say,
"how does it turn out after all? Why, here she is, 100 a year. I give her 100, which she is pleased to term handsome, keeping the house of Josiah Bounderby of Coketown."
Nay, he made this foil of his so very widely known, that third parties took it up, and handled it on some occasions with considerable briskness. It was one of the most exasperating attributes of Bounderby, that he not only sang his own praises, but stimulated other men to sing them. There was a moral infection of claptrap in him. Strangers, modest enough elsewhere, started up at dinners in Coketown, and boasted, in quite a rampant way, of Bounderby. They made him out to be the Royal Arms, the Union Jack, Magna Carta, John Bull, Habeas Corpus, the Bill of Rights, an Englishman's house is his castle, Church and State, and God save the Queen, all put together. And as often, and it was very often, as an orator of this kind brought into his peroration, "Princes and lords may flourish or may fade, a breath can make them, as a breath has made," it was, for certain, more or less understood among the company that he had heard of Mrs. Sparsit.
"Mr. Bounderby,"
said Mrs. Sparsit,
"you are unusually slow, sir, with your breakfast this morning."
"Why, ma'am,"
he returned,
"I am thinking about Tom Gradgrind's whim."
Tom Gradgrind, for a bluff, independent manner of speaking, as if somebody were always endeavouring to bribe him with immense sums to say Thomas, and he wouldn't.
Tom Gradgrind's whim, ma'am, of bringing up the tumbling girl.
The girl is now waiting to know,
said Mrs. Sparsit,
whether she is to go straight to the school or up to the lodge.
She must wait, ma'am,
answered Bounderby,
till I know myself. We shall have Tom Gradgrind down here presently, I suppose. If he should wish her to remain here a day or two longer, of course she can, ma'am.
Of course she can, if you wish it, Mr. Bounderby.
I told him I would give her a shake down here last night, in order that he might sleep on it, before he decided to let her have any association with Louisa.
Indeed, Mr. Bounderby. Very thoughtful of you.
Mrs. Sparsit's Coriolanian nose underwent a slight expansion of the nostrils, and her black eyebrows contracted, as she took a sip of tea.
It's tolerably clear to me,
said Bounderby,
that the little puss can get small good out of such companionship.
Are you speaking of young Miss Gradgrind, Mr. Bounderby?
Yes, ma'am, I'm speaking of Louisa.
Your observation being limited to little puss,
said Mrs. Sparsit,
and there being two little girls in question, I did not know which might be indicated by that expression.
Louisa,
repeated Bounderby.
Louisa, Louisa.
You are quite another father to Louisa, sir.
Mrs. Sparsit took a little more tea, and, as she bent her again contracted eyebrows over her steaming cup, rather looked as if her classical countenance were invoking the infernal gods.
If you had said I was another father to Tom, young Tom, I mean, not my friend Tom Gradgrind, you might have been nearer the mark. I'm going to take young Tom into my office. Going to have him under my wing, ma'am.
Indeed? Rather young for that, is he not, sir?
Mrs. Sparsit's "sir," in addressing Mr. Bounderby, was a word of ceremony, rather exacting consideration for herself in the use than honouring him.
Now, I'm not going to take him at once. He's to finish his educational cramming before then,
said Bounderby.
By the Lord Harry, he'll have enough of it, first and last. He'd open his eyes, that boy would, if he knew how empty of learning my young Mo was at his time of life.
Which, by the by, he probably did know, for he had heard of it often enough.
But it's extraordinary the difficulty I have on scores of such subjects, in speaking to any one on equal terms. Here, for example, I've been speaking to you this morning about tumblers. Why, what do you know about tumblers? At the time when to have been a tumbler in the mud of the streets would have been a godsend to me, a prize in the lottery to me, ma'am, you were at the Italian Opera. You were coming out of the Italian Opera, ma'am, in white satin and jewels, a blaze of splendour, when I hadn't a penny to buy a link to light you.
Ay, certainly, sir,
returned Mrs. Sparsit, with a dignity serenely mournful.
Was familiar with the Italian opera at a very early age.
Egad, ma'am, so was I,
said Bounderby,
with the wrong side of it. A hard bed the pavement of its arcade used to make, I assure you. People like you, ma'am, accustomed from infancy to lie on down feathers, have no idea how hard a paving stone is without trying it. And no, it's no use my talking to you about tumblers. I should speak of foreign dancers, and the West End of London, and Mayfair, and lords and ladies and honourables.
I trust, sir,
rejoined Mrs. Sparsit, with decent resignation,
it is not necessary that you should do anything of that kind. I hope I have learnt how to accommodate myself to the changes of life. If I have acquired an interest in hearing of your instructive experiences, and can scarcely hear enough of them, I claim no merit for that, since I believe it is a general sentiment.
Well, ma'am,
said her patron,
perhaps some people may be pleased to say that they do like to hear, in his own unpolished way, what Josiah Bounderby of Coketown has gone through. But you must confess that you were born in the lap of luxury yourself. Come, ma'am, you know you were born in the lap of luxury.
I do not, sir.
returned Mrs. Sparsit, with a shake of her head.
Deny it.
Mr. Bounderby was obliged to get up from the table and stand with his back to the fire, looking at her. She was such an enhancement of his position.
And you were in crack society, devilish high society,
he said, warming his legs.
It is true, sir.
With an affectation of humility the very opposite of his, and therefore in no danger of jostling it.
You were in the tip-top fashion, and all the rest of it,
said Mr. Bounderby.
Yes, sir,
returned Mrs. Sparsit, with a kind of social widowhood upon her.
It is unquestionably true.
Mr. Bounderby, bending himself at the knees, literally embraced his legs in his great satisfaction, and laughed aloud. Mr. and Miss Gradgrind being then announced, he received the former with a shake of the hand, and the latter with a kiss.
"Can Jupe be sent here, Bounderby?"
asked Mr. Gradgrind. Certainly. So Jupe was sent there. On coming in, she curtsied to Mr. Bounderby and to his friend Tom Gradgrind, and also to Louisa, but in her confusion unluckily omitted Mrs. Sparsit. Observing this, the blustrous Bounderby had the following remarks to make.
"Now, I tell you what, my girl, the name of that lady by the teapot is Mrs. Sparsit. That lady acts as mistress of this house, and she is a highly connected lady. Consequently, if ever you come into any room in this house, you will make a short stay in it if you don't behave towards that lady in your most respectful manner. Now, I don't care a button what you do to me, because I don't affect to be anybody. So far from having high connections, I have no connections at all, and I come from the scum of the earth. But towards that lady I do care what you do, and you shall do what is deferential and respectful, or you shall not come here."
"I hope, Bounderby,"
said Mr. Gradgrind, in a conciliatory voice,
"that this was merely an oversight."
"My friend Tom Gradgrind suggests, Mrs. Sparsit,"
said Bounderby,
"that this was merely an oversight. Very likely. However, as you are aware, ma'am, I don't allow of even oversights towards you."
You are very good indeed, sir,
returned Mrs. Sparsit, shaking her head with her state humility.
It is not worth speaking of.
Sissy, who all this time had been faintly excusing herself with tears in her eyes, was now waved over by the master of the house to Mr. Gradgrind. She stood looking intently at him, and Louisa stood coldly by, with her eyes upon the ground, while he proceeded thus.
"Jupe, I have made up my mind to take you into my house, and when you are not in attendance at the school, to employ you about Mrs. Gradgrind, who is rather an invalid. I have explained to Miss Louisa, this is Miss Louisa, the miserable but natural end of your late career, and you are to expressly understand that the whole of that subject is past, and it is not to be referred to any more. From this time you begin your history. You are, at present, ignorant, I know."
"Yes, sir, very,"
she answered, curtsying.
"I shall have the satisfaction of causing you to be strictly educated, and you will be a living proof to all who come into communication with you of the advantages of the training you will receive. You will be reclaimed and formed. You have been in the habit now of reading to your father and those people I found you among, I dare say?"
said Mr. Gradgrind, beckoning her nearer to him before he said so, and dropping his voice.
"Only to father and Merrylegs, sir. At least I mean to father, when Merrylegs was always there."
"Never mind Merrylegs, Jupe,"
said Mr. Gradgrind, with a passing frown.
"I don't ask about him. I understand you to have been in the habit of reading to your father."
"Oh, yes, sir, thousands of times. They were the happiest, of all the happy times we had together, sir."
It was only now, when her sorrow broke out, that Louisa looked at her.
"And what,"
asked Mr. Gradgrind, in a still lower voice,
did you read to your father, Jupe?
About the fairies, sir, and the dwarf, and the hunchback, and the genies.
She sobbed out.
And about—
Hush,
said Mr. Gradgrind.
That is enough. Never breathe a word of such destructive nonsense any more. Bounderby, this is a case for a rigid training, and I shall observe it with interest.
Well,
returned Mr. Bounderby,
I have given you my opinion already, and I shouldn't do as you do. But very well, since you are bent upon it, very well.
So Mr. Gradgrind and his daughter took Cecilia Jupe off with them to Stone Lodge, and on the way Louisa never spoke one word, good or bad, and Mr. Bounderby went about his daily pursuits, and Mrs. Sparsit got behind her eyebrows and meditated in the gloom of that retreat all the evening. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 8. Never Wonder. Let us strike the keynote again, before pursuing the tune. When she was half a dozen years younger, Louisa had been overheard to begin a conversation with her brother one day by saying,
"Tom, I wonder—"
upon which Mr. Gradgrind, who was the person overhearing, stepped forth into the light and said,
"Louisa, never wonder."
Herein lay the spring of the mechanical art and mystery of educating the reason without stooping to the cultivation of the sentiments and affections. Never wonder. By means of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, settle everything somehow, and never wonder. Bring to me, says M'Choakumchild, yonder baby just able to walk, and I will engage that it shall never wonder. Now, besides very many babies just able to walk, there happened to be in Coketown a considerable population of babies who had been walking against time towards the infinite world 20, 30, 40, 50 years or more. These portentous infants being alarming creatures to stalk about in any human society, the 18 denominations incessantly scratched one another's faces and pulled one another's hair, by way of agreeing on the steps to be taken for their improvement, which they never did. A surprising circumstance, when the happy adaptation of the means to the end is considered. Still, although they differed in every other particular, conceivable and inconceivable, especially inconceivable, they were pretty well united on the point that these unlucky infants were never to wonder. Body number 1 said they must take everything on trust. Body number 2 said they must take everything on political economy. Body number 3 wrote leaden little books for them, showing how the good grown-up baby invariably got to the savings bank, and the bad grown-up baby invariably got transported. Body number 4, under dreary pretences of being droll, when it was very melancholy indeed, made the shallowed pretences of concealing pitfalls of knowledge, into which it was the duty of these babies to be smuggled and inveigled. But all the bodies agreed that they were never to wonder. There was a library in Coketown, to which general access was easy. Mr. Gradgrind greatly tormented his mind about what the people read in this library, a point whereon little rivers of tabular statements periodically flowed into the howling ocean of tabular statements, which no diver ever got to any depth in and came up sane. It was a disheartening circumstance, but a melancholy fact, that even these readers persisted in wondering. They wondered about human nature, human passions, human hopes and fears, the struggles, triumphs, and defeats, the cares and joys and sorrows, the lives and deaths of common men and women. They sometimes, after 15 hours' work, sat down to read mere fables about men and women more or less like themselves, and about children more or less like their own. They took Defoe to their bosoms instead of Euclid, and seemed to be, on the whole, more comforted by Goldsmith than by Cocker. Mr. Gradgrind was forever working, in print and out of print, at this eccentric sum, and he could never make out how it yielded this unaccountable product.
I am sick of my life, Lou. I hate it altogether. I hate everybody, except you,
said the unnatural young Thomas Gradgrind in the hair-cutting chamber at twilight.
You don't hate Sissy, Tom.
I hate to be obliged to call her Jupe, and she hates me,
said Tom moodily.
No, she does not, Tom, I'm sure.
She must,
said Tom.
She must just hate and detest the whole set out of us. They'll bother her head off, I think, before they have done with her. Already she's getting as pale as wax, and as heavy as I am.
Young Thomas expressed his sentiments sitting astride of a chair before the fire, with his arms on the back, and his sulky face on his arms. His sister sat in the darker corner by the fireside, now looking at him, now looking at the bright sparks as they dropped upon the hearth.
As to me,
said Tom, tumbling his hair all manner of ways with his sulky hands,
I am a donkey, that's what I am. I am as obstinate as one, I am more stupid than one, I get as much pleasure as one, and I should like to kick like one.
Not me, I hope, Tom.
No, Lou, I wouldn't hurt you. I made an exception of you at first. I don't know what this jolly old jaundiced jail.
Tom had paused to find a sufficiently complimentary and expressive name for his parental roof, and seemed to relieve his mind for a moment by the strong alliteration of this one.
I would be without you.
Indeed, Tom? Do you really and truly say so?
Why, of course I do. What's the use of talking about it?
Returned Tom, chafing his face on his coat-sleeve as if to mortify his flesh and have it in unison with his spirit.
Because, Tom,
said his sister, after silently watching the sparks a while,
as I get older and nearer growing up, I often sit wondering here and think how unfortunate it is for me that I can't reconcile you to home better than I am able to do. I don't know what other girls know. I can't play to you or sing to you. I can't talk to you so as to lighten your mind, for I never see any amusing sights or read any amusing books that it would be a pleasure or a relief to you to talk about when you are tired.
Well, no more do I. I am as bad as you in that respect, and I am a mule too, which you're not. If father was determined to make me either a prig or a mule, and I am not a prig, why, it stands to reason I must be a mule, and so I am,
said Tom, desperately.
It's a great pity,
said Louisa, after another pause, and speaking thoughtfully out of her dark corner.
It's a great pity, Tom. It's very unfortunate for both of us.
Oh, you,
said Tom.
You are a girl, Lou, and a girl comes out of it better than a boy does. I don't miss anything in you. You're the only pleasure I have. You can brighten even this place, and you can always lead me as you like.
You are a dear brother, Tom, and while you think I can do such things, I don't so much mind knowing better. Though I do know better, Tom, and am very sorry for it.
She came and kissed him, and went back into her corner again.
I wish I could collect all the facts we hear so much about,
said Tom, spitefully setting his teeth,
and all the figures, and all the people who found them out, and I wish I could put 1,000 barrels of gunpowder under them and blow them all up together. However, when I go to live with old Bounderby, I'll have my revenge.
Your revenge, Tom?
I mean, I'll enjoy myself a little, and go about and see something, and hear something. I'll recompense myself for the way in which I've been brought up.
But don't disappoint yourself beforehand, Tom. Mr. Bounderby thinks as father thinks, and is a great deal rougher and not half so kind.
Oh,
said Tom, laughing.
I don't mind that. I shall very well know how to manage and smooth old Bounderby.
Their shadows were defined upon the wall, but those of the high presses in the room were all blended together on the wall and the ceiling, as if the brother and sister were overhung by a dark cavern; or a fanciful imagination, if such treason could have been there, might have made it out to be the shadow of their subject, and of its lowering association with their future.
What is your great mode of smoothing and managing, Tom? Is it a secret?
Oh,
said Tom.
if it is a secret, it's not far off. It's you. You are his little pet. You are his favourite. He'll do anything for you. When he says to me what I don't like, I shall say to him, "My sister Lou will be hurt and disappointed, Mr. Bounderby. She always used to tell me she was sure you would be easier with me than this." That'll bring him about, or nothing will.
After waiting for some answering remark and getting none, Tom wearily relapsed into the present time, and twined himself yawning round and about the rails of his chair, and rumpled his head more and more, until he suddenly looked up, and asked,
"Have you gone to sleep, Lou?"
No, Tom. I am looking at the fire.
"You seem to find more to look at in it than ever I could find."
said Tom.
"Another of the advantages, I suppose, of being a girl."
Tom?
inquired his sister slowly, and in a curious tone, as if she were reading what she asked in the fire, and it was not quite plainly written there.
Do you look forward with any satisfaction to this change to Mr. Bounderby's?
"Why, there's one thing to be said of it,"
returned Tom, pushing his chair from him, and standing up.
"It will be getting away from home."
There is one thing to be said of it.
Louisa repeated in her former curious tone.
It will be getting away from home. Yes.
"Not but I shall be very unwilling, both to leave you, Lou, and to leave you here. But I must go, you know, whether I like it or not, and I had better go where I can take with me some advantage or influence, than where I should lose it altogether. Don't you see?"
Yes, Tom.
The answer was so long in coming, though there was no indecision in it, that Tom went and leaned on the back of her chair, to contemplate the fire which so engrossed her from her point of view, and see what he could make of it.
"Except that it is a fire,"
said Tom.
"it looks to me as stupid as blank as everything else looks. What do you see in it? Not a circus?"
I don't see anything in it, Tom, particularly. But since I have been looking at it, I have been wondering about you and me, grown up.
"Wondering again,"
said Tom.
I have such unmanageable thoughts,
returned his sister.
That they will wonder.
Then I beg of you, Louisa,
said Mrs. Gradgrind, who had opened the door without being heard,
to do nothing of that description, for goodness' sake, you inconsiderate girl, or I shall never hear the last of it from your father. And, Thomas, it's really shameful, with my poor head continually wearing me out, that a boy brought up as you have been, and whose education has cost what yours has, should be found encouraging his sister to wander, when he knows his father has expressly said that she is not to do it.
Louisa denied Tom's participation in the offence, but her mother stopped her with the conclusive answer,
Louisa, don't tell me in my state of health, for unless you had been encouraged, it is morally and physically impossible that you could have done it.
I was encouraged by nothing, mother, but by looking at the red sparks dropping out of the fire, and whitening and dying. It made me think, after all, how short my life would be, and how little I could hope to do in it.
Nonsense,
said Mrs. Gradgrind, rendered almost energetic.
Nonsense! Don't stand there and tell me such stuff, Louisa, to my face, when you know very well that if it was ever to reach your father's ears I should never hear the last of it, after all the trouble that has been taken with you, after the lectures you have attended and the experiments you have seen, after I have heard you myself, when the whole of my right side has been benumbed, going on with your master about combustion, and calcination, and calorification, and, I may say, every kind of ation that could drive a poor invalid distracted to hear you talking in this absurd way about sparks and ashes. I wish,
whimpered Mrs. Gradgrind, taking a chair, and discharging her strongest points before succumbing under these mere shadows of facts.
Yes, I really do wish that I had never had a family, and then you would have known what it was to do without me.
End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Hard Times by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times by Charles Dickens. Chapter 9. Cissy's Progress. Sissy Jupe had not an easy time of it between Mr. M'Choakumchild and Mrs. Gradgrind, and was not without strong impulses, in the first months of her probation, to run away. It hailed facts all day long so very hard, and life in general was opened to her as such a closely ruled ciphering book, that assuredly she would have run away, but for only one restraint. It is lamentable to think of, but this restraint was the result of no arithmetical process, was self-imposed in defiance of all calculation, and went dead against any table of probabilities that any actuary would have drawn up from the premises. The girl believed that her father had not deserted her. She lived in hope that he would come back, and in the faith that he would be made the happier by her remaining where she was. The wretched ignorance with which Jupe clung to this consolation, rejecting the superior comfort of knowing, on a sound arithmetical basis, that her father was an unnatural vagabond, filled Mr. Gradgrind with pity. Yet what was to be done? M'Choakumchild reported that she had a very dense head for figures, that, once possessed with a general idea of the globe, she took the smallest conceivable interest in its exact measurements, that she was extremely slow in the acquisition of dates, unless some pitiful incident happened to be connected therewith, that she would burst into tears on being required, by the mental process, immediately to name the cost of 247 muslin caps at 14 pence halfpenny, that she was as low down in the school as low could be, that after 8 weeks of induction into the elements of political economy she had only yesterday been set right by a prattler 3 feet high, for returning to the question, what is the first principle of this science, the absurd answer,
To do unto others as I would that they should do unto me.
Mr. Gradgrind observed, shaking his head, that all this was very bad, that it showed the necessity of infinite grinding at the mill of knowledge, as per system, schedule, blue book, report, and tabular statements A to Z, and that Jupe
must be kept to it.
So Jupe was kept to it, and became low-spirited, but no wiser.
It would be a fine thing to be you, Miss Louisa,
she said one night, when Louisa had endeavoured to make her perplexities for next day something clearer to her.
Do you think so?
I should know so much, Miss Louisa. All that is difficult to me now would be so easy then.
You might not be the better for it, Sissy.
Sissy submitted, after a little hesitation.
I should not be the worse, Miss Louisa.
To which Miss Louisa answered,
I don't know that.
There had been so little communication between these two, both because life at Stone Lodge went monotonously round like a piece of machinery, which discouraged human interference, and because of the prohibition relative to Sissy's past career, that they were still almost strangers. Sissy, with her dark eyes wandering directly at Louisa's face, was uncertain whether to say more or to remain silent.
You are more useful to my mother, and more pleasant with her than I can ever be,
Louisa resumed.
You are pleasanter to yourself than I am to myself.
But if you please, Miss Louisa,
Sissy pleaded,
I am, oh, so stupid.
Louisa, with a brighter laugh than usual, told her she would be wiser by and by.
You don't know,
said Sissy, half crying,
what a stupid girl I am. All through school hours I make mistakes. Mr. and Mrs. M'Choakumchild call me up over and over again regularly to make mistakes. I can't help them. They seem to come natural to me.
Mr. and Mrs. M'Choakumchild never make any mistakes themselves, I suppose, Sissy?
Oh, no,
she eagerly returned.
They know everything.
Tell me some of your mistakes.
I am almost ashamed,
said Sissy, with reluctance.
But today, for instance, Mr. M'Choakumchild was explaining to us about natural prosperity.
National, I think it must have been,
observed Louisa.
Yes, it was, but isn't it the same?
She timidly asked.
You had better say national, as he said so.
returned Louisa, with her dry reserve.
National prosperity. And he said, now, this schoolroom is a nation, and in this nation there are 50 millions of money. Isn't this a prosperous nation? Girl number 20, isn't this a prosperous nation? And aren't you in a thriving state?
What did you say?
Asked Louisa.
Miss Louisa, I said I didn't know. I thought I couldn't know whether it was a prosperous nation or not, and whether I was in a thriving state or not, unless I knew who had got the money, and whether any of it was mine. But that had nothing to do with it. It was not in the figures at all,
said Sissy, wiping her eyes.
That was a great mistake of yours,
observed Louisa.
Yes, Miss Louisa, I know it was, now. Then Mr. M'Choakumchild said he would try me again, and he said, this schoolroom is an immense town, and in it there are 1,000,000 of inhabitants, and only 25 are starved to death in the streets, in the course of a year. What is your remark on that proportion? And my remark was, for I couldn't think of a better one, that I thought it must be just as hard upon those who were starved, whether the others were 1,000,000 or 1,000,000. And that was wrong too.
Of course it was.
Then Mr. M'Choakumchild said he would try me once more, and he said, here are the stutterings.
Statistics,
said Louisa.
Yes, Miss Louisa, they always remind me of stutterings, and that's another of my mistakes, of accidents upon the sea. And I find, Mr. M'Choakumchild said, that in a given time 100,000 persons went to sea on long voyages, and only 500 of them were drowned or burnt to death. What is the percentage? And I said, miss—
Here Sissy fairly sobbed, as confessing with extreme contrition to her greatest error.
I said it was nothing.
Nothing, Sissy?
Nothing, miss, to the relations and friends of the people who were killed. I shall never learn,
said Sissy.
And the worst of all is, that although my poor father wished me so much to learn, and although I am so anxious to learn, because he wished me to, I am afraid I don't like it.
Louisa stood looking at the pretty, modest head, as it drooped abashed before her, until it was raised again to glance at her face. Then she asked,
Did your father know so much himself that he wished you to be well taught too, Sissy?
Sissy hesitated before replying, and so plainly showed her sense that they were entering on forbidden ground, that Louisa added,
No one hears us, and if any one did, I am sure no harm could be found in such an innocent question.
No, Miss Louisa,
answered Sissy, upon this encouragement shaking her head.
Father knows very little indeed. It's as much as he can do to write, and it's more than people in general can do to read his writing, though it's plain to me.
Your mother?
Father says she was quite a scholar. She died when I was born. She was—
Sissy made the terrible communication nervously.
She was a dancer.
Did your father love her?
Louisa asked these questions with a strong, wild, wandering interest peculiar to her, an interest gone astray like a banished creature, and hiding in solitary places.
Oh, yes, as dearly as he loves me. Father loved me first for her sake. He carried me about with him when I was quite a baby. We have never been asunder from that time.
Yet he leaves you now, Sissy.
Only for my good. Nobody understands him as I do. Nobody knows him as I do. When he left me for my good, he never would have left me for his own. I know he was almost broken-hearted with the trial. He will not be happy for a single minute till he comes back.
Tell me more about him,
said Louisa.
I will never ask you again. Where did you live?
We travelled about the country, and had no fixed place to live in. Father's a—
Sissy whispered the awful word.
A clown.
To make the people laugh,
said Louisa, with a nod of intelligence.
Yes, but they wouldn't laugh sometimes, and then father cried. Lately they very often wouldn't laugh, and he used to come home despairing. Father's not like most. Those who didn't know him as well as I do, and didn't love him as dearly as I do, might believe he was not quite right. Sometimes they played tricks upon him, but they never knew how he felt them, and shrunk up when he was alone with me. He was far, far timider than they thought.
And you were his comfort through everything?
She nodded, with the tears rolling down her face.
I hope so, and father said I was. It was because he grew so scared and trembling, and because he felt himself to be a poor, weak, ignorant, helpless man, those used to be his words, that he wanted me so much to know a great deal, and be different from him. I used to read to him to cheer his courage, and he was very fond of that. They were wrong books. I am never to speak of them here, but we didn't know there was any harm in them.
And he liked them,
said Louisa, with a searching gaze on Sissy all this time.
Oh, very much. They kept him many times from what did him real harm. And often of a night he used to forget all his troubles in wondering whether the Sultan would let the lady go on with the story, or would have her head cut off before it was finished.
And your father was always kind, to the last?
Asked Louisa, contravening the great principle, and wondering very much.
Always, always,
returned Sissy, clasping her hands.
Kinder and kinder than I can tell. He was angry only one night, and that was not to me, but Merrylegs. Merrylegs is his performing dog.
Why was he angry with the dog?
Louisa demanded.
Father, soon after they came home from performing, told Merrylegs to jump up on the backs of the 2 chairs and stand across them, which is one of his tricks. He looked at Father and didn't do it at once. Everything of Father's had gone wrong that night, and he hadn't pleased the public at all. He cried out that the very dog knew he was failing, and had no compassion on him. Then he beat the dog, and I was frightened, and said, Father, Father, pray don't hurt the creature who is so fond of you. Oh, heaven forgive you, Father, stop. And he stopped, and the dog was bloody, and Father lay down crying on the floor with the dog in his arms, and the dog licked his face.
Louisa saw that she was sobbing, and going to her, kissed her, took her hand, and sat down beside her.
Finish by telling me how your father left you, Sissy. Now that I have asked you so much, tell me the end. The blame, if there is any blame, is mine, not yours.
Dear Miss Louisa,
said Sissy, covering her eyes, and sobbing yet,
I came home from school that afternoon, and found poor Father just come home too, from the booth. And he sat rocking himself over the fire as if he was in pain. And I said, Have you hurt yourself, Father? As he did sometimes, like they all did. And he said, A little, my darling. And when I came to stoop down and look up at his face, I saw that he was crying. The more I spoke to him, the more he hid his face. And at first he shook all over, and said nothing but, My darling and my love.
Here Tom came lounging in, and stared at the two with a coolness not particularly savouring of interest in anything but himself, and not much of that at present.
I am asking Sissy a few questions, Tom,
observed his sister.
You have no occasion to go away, but don't interrupt us for a moment, Tom dear.
Oh, very well,
returned Tom.
Only Father's brought old Bounderby home, and I want you to come into the drawing-room, because if you come, there's a good chance of old Bounderby's asking me to dinner, and if you don't, there's none.
I'll come directly.
I'll wait for you,
said Tom.
To make sure.
Sissy resumed in a lower voice.
At last poor Father said that he had given no satisfaction again, and never did give any satisfaction now, and that he was a shame and disgrace, and I should have done better without him all along. I said all the affectionate things to him that came into my heart, and presently he was quiet, and I sat down by him, and told him all about the school, and everything that had been said and done there. When I had no more left to tell, he put his arms round my neck, and kissed me a great many times. Then he asked me to fetch some of the stuff he used, for the little hurt he had had, and to get it at the best place, which was at the other end of town from there, and then, after kissing me again, he let me go. When I had gone downstairs, I turned back that I might be a little bit more company to him yet, and looked in at the door, and said, Father dear, shall I take Merrylegs? Father shook his head and said, No, Sissy, no. Take nothing that's known to be mine, my darling. And I left him sitting by the fire. Then the thought must have come upon him, poor, poor Father, of going away to try something for my sake, for when I came back, he was gone.
I say, look sharp for old Bounderby, Lou,
Tom remonstrated.
There's no more to tell, Miss Louisa. I keep the 9 oils ready for him, and I know he will come back. Every letter that I see in Mr. Gradgrind's hand takes my breath away and blinds my eyes, for I think it comes from Father, or from Mr. Sleary about Father. Mr. Sleary promised to write as soon as ever Father should be heard of, and I trust him to keep his word.
Do look sharp for old Bounderby, Lou,
said Tom, with an impatient whistle.
He'll be off if you don't look sharp.
After this, whenever Sissy dropped a curtsy to Mr. Gradgrind in the presence of his family, and said in a faltering way,
I beg your pardon, sir, for being troublesome, but have you had any letter yet about me?
Louisa would suspend the occupation of the moment, whatever it was, and look for the reply as earnestly as Sissy did. And when Mr. Gradgrind regularly answered,
No, Jupe, Nothing of the sort.
The trembling of Cissy's lip would be repeated in Louisa's face, and her eyes would follow Cissy with compassion to the door. Mr. Gradgrind usually improved these occasions by remarking, when she was gone, that if Jupe had been properly trained from an early age, she would have remonstrated to herself on sound principles the baselessness of these fantastic hopes. Yet it did seem, though not to him, for he saw nothing of it, as if fantastic hope could take as strong a hold as fact. This observation must be limited exclusively to his daughter. As to Tom, he was becoming that not unprecedented triumph of calculation which is usually at work on number one. As to Mrs. Gradgrind, if she said anything on the subject, she would come a little way out of her wrappers, like a feminine dormouse, and say,
"Good gracious, bless me, how my poor head is vexed and worried by that girl Jupe so perseveringly asking over and over again about her tiresome letters. Upon my word and honour, I seem to be fated and destined and ordained to live in the midst of things that I am never to hear the last of. It really is a most extraordinary circumstance that it appears as if I never was to hear the last of anything."
At about this point Mr. Gradgrind's eye would fall upon her, and under the influence of that wintry piece of fact she would become torpid again. Chapter 10. of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 10. Stephen Blackpool. I entertain a weak idea that the English people are as hard-worked as any people upon whom the sun shines. I acknowledge to this ridiculous idiosyncrasy as a reason why I would give them a little more play. In the hardest working part of Coketown, in the innermost fortifications of that ugly citadel, where nature was as strongly bricked out as killing airs and gases were bricked in, at the heart of the labyrinth of narrow courts upon courts, and close streets upon streets, which had come into existence piecemeal, every piece in a violent hurry for some one man's purpose, and the whole an unnatural family, shouldering and trampling and pressing one another to death, in the last close nook of this great exhausted receiver, where the chimneys, for want of air to make a draught, were built in an immense variety of stunted and crooked shapes, as though every house put out a sign of the kind of people who might be expected to be born in it. Among the multitude of Coketown, generally called the Hands, a race who would have found more favour with some people if Providence had seen fit to make them only hands, or, like the lower creatures of the seashore, only hands and stomachs, lived a certain Stephen Blackpool, 40 years of age. Stephen looked older, but he had had a hard life. It is said that every life has its roses and thorns. There seemed, however, to have been a misadventure or mistake in Stephen's case, whereby somebody else had become possessed of his roses, and he had become possessed of the same somebody else's thorns, in addition to his own. He had known, to use his words, a peck of trouble. He was usually called Old Stephen, in a kind of rough homage to the fact. A rather stooping man, with a knitted brow, a pondering expression of face, and a hard-looking head sufficiently capacious, on which his iron-grey hair lay long and thin, old Stephen might have passed for a particularly intelligent man in his condition, yet he was not. He took no place among those remarkable hands, who, piercing together their broken intervals of leisure through many years, had mastered difficult sciences, and acquired a knowledge of most unlikely things. He held no station among the hands who could make speeches and carry on debates. Thousands of his compeers could talk much better than he at any time. He was a good power-loom weaver, and a man of perfect integrity. What more he was, or what else he had in him, if anything, let him show for himself. The lights in the great factories, which looked, when they were illuminated, like fairy palaces, or the travellers by express train said so, were all extinguished, and the bells had rung for knocking off for the night, and ceased again, and the hands, men and women, boy and girl, were clattering home. Old Stephen was standing in the street, with the old sensation upon him which the stoppage of the machinery always produced, the sensation of its having worked and stopped in his own head.
"Yet I don't see Rachel still,"
said he. It was a wet night, and many groups of young women passed him, with their shawls drawn over their bare heads, and held close under their chins to keep the rain out. He knew Rachel well, for a glance at any one of these groups was sufficient to show him that she was not there. At last there were no more to come, and then he turned away, saying in a tone of disappointment,
"Why, then I missed her."
But he had not gone the length of 3 streets when he saw another of the shawled figures in advance of him, at which he looked so keenly that perhaps its mere shadow, indistinctly reflected on the wet pavement, if he could have seen it without the figure itself moving along from lamp to lamp, brightening and fading as it went, would have been enough to tell him who was there. Making his pace at once much quicker and much softer, he darted on until he was very near this figure, then fell into his former walk, and called,
"Rachel!"
She turned, being then in the brightness of a lamp, and, raising her hood a little, showed a quiet oval face, dark and rather delicate, irradiated by a pair of very gentle eyes, and further set off by the perfect order of her shining black hair. It was not a face in its first bloom. She was a woman 35 years of age.
"Ah, lad, 'tis thou."
When she had said this, with a smile which would have been quite expressed, though nothing of her had been seen but her pleasant eyes, she replaced her hood again, and they went on together.
"I thought thou was behind me, Rachel."
"No."
"Early to night, lass."
"Times I'm a little early, Stephen, times a little late. I'm never to be counted on going home."
"No go it t'other way neither, seems to me, Rachel."
"No, Stephen."
He looked at her with some disappointment in his face, but with a respectful and patient conviction that she must be right in whatever she did. The expression was not lost upon her. She laid her hand lightly on his arm a moment, as if to thank him for it.
"We are such true friends, lad, and such old friends, and getting to be such old folk now."
"Nay, Rachel, thou art as young as ever thou was."
"One of us would be puzzled how to get old, Stephen, without t'other getting so too, both being alive. But anyways, we're such old friends, and to hide a word of honest truth from one another would be a sin and a pity. 'Tis better not to walk too much together. Times, yes, 'twould be hard indeed if 'twas not to be at all,"
she said, with a cheerfulness she sought to communicate to him.
"'Tis hard always, Rachel."
"Try to think not, and 'twill seem better."
"I've tried a long time, and it ain't got better. But thou art reet. Might make folk talk even o' thee. Thou hast been that to me, Rachel, through so many year. Thou hast done me so much good, and heartened of me in that cheering way that thy word is law to me. Ah, lass, and a bright good law. Better than some real ones."
"Never fret about them, Stephen,"
she answered quickly, and not without an anxious glance at his face.
"Let the laws be."
"Yes,"
he said, with a slow nod or two.
"Let 'em be, let everything be, let all sort alone. 'Tis a muddle, and that's all."
"Always a muddle,"
said Rachel, with another gentle touch upon his arm, as if to recall him out of the thoughtfulness in which he was biting the long ends of his loose neckerchief as he walked along. The touch had its instantaneous effect. He let them fall, turning a smiling face upon her, and said, as he broke into a good-humoured laugh,
Aye, Rachel, lass, all's a muddle. That's where I stick. I come to muddle many times and again and never get beyond it.
They had walked some distance, and were near their own homes. The woman's was the first reached. It was in one of the many small streets for which the favourite undertaker, who turned a handsome sum out of the one poor ghastly pomp of the neighbourhood, kept a black ladder, in order that those who had done their daily groping up and down the narrow stairs might slide out of this working world by the windows. She stopped at the corner, and putting her hand in his, wished him good night.
Good night, dear lass. Good night.
She went, with her neat figure and her sober womanly step, down the dark street, and he stood looking after her until she turned into one of the small houses. There was not a flutter of her coarse shawl, perhaps, but had its interest in this man's eyes; not a tone of her voice but had its echo in his innermost heart. When she was lost to his view, he pursued his homeward way, glancing up sometimes at the sky, where the clouds were sailing fast and wildly. But they were broken now, and the rain had ceased, and the moon shone, looking down the high chimneys of Coketown on the deep furnaces below, and casting titanic shadows of the steam-engines at rest upon the walls where they were lodged. The man seemed to have brightened with the night as he went on. His home, in such another street as the first, saying that it was narrower, was over a little shop. How it came to pass that any people found it worth their while to sell or buy the wretched little toys, mixed up in his window with cheap newspapers and pork, there was a leg to be raffled for to-morrow night, matters not here. He took his end of candle from a shelf, lighted it at another end of candle on the counter, without disturbing the mistress of the shop, who was asleep in her little room, and went upstairs into his lodging. It was a room not unacquainted with the black ladder under various tenants, but as neat at present as such a room could be. A few books and writings were on an old bureau in a corner. The furniture was decent and sufficient, and though the atmosphere was tainted, the room was clean. Going to the hearth to set the candle down upon a round three-legged table standing there, he stumbled against something. As he recoiled, looking down at it, it raised itself up into the form of a woman in a sitting attitude.
Heaven's mercy, woman!
He cried, falling further off from the figure.
Hast thou come back again?
Such a woman! A disabled, drunken creature, barely able to preserve her sitting posture by steadying herself, with one begrimed hand on the floor, while the other was so purposeless in trying to push away her tangled hair from her face, that it only blinded her the more with the dirt upon it. A creature so foul to look at, in her tatters, stains, and splashes, but so much fouler than that in her moral infamy, that it was a shameful thing even to see her. After an impatient oath or two, and some stupid clawing of herself with the hand not necessary to her support, she got her hair away from her eyes sufficiently to obtain a sight of him. Then she sat swaying her body to and fro, and making gestures with her unnerved arm which seemed intended as the accompaniment to a fit of laughter, though her face was stolid and drowsy.
Lad, what, are you there?
Some hoarse sounds meant for this came mockingly out of her at last, and her head dropped forward on her breast.
Back again?
She screeched, after some minutes, as if he had that moment said it.
Yes, I'm back again. Back again ever and ever so often. Back? Yes, back. Why not?
Roused by the unmeaning violence with which she cried it out, she scrambled up, and stood supporting herself with her shoulders against the wall, dangling in one hand by the string a dunghill fragment of a bonnet, and trying to look scornfully at him.
I'll sell thee off again, and I'll sell thee off again, and I'll sell thee off a score of times,
she cried, with something between a furious menace and an effort at a defiant dance.
Come away from the bed.
He was sitting on the side of it, with his face hidden in his hands.
Come away from 'tis mine and I've a right to it.
As she staggered to it, he avoided her with a shudder, and passed, his face still hidden, to the opposite end of the room. She threw herself upon the bed heavily, and soon was snoring hard. He sunk into a chair, and moved but once all that night. It was to throw a covering over her, as if his hands were not enough to hide her, even in the dark. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 11. No Way Out. The fairy palaces burst into illumination before pale morning showed the monstrous serpents of smoke trailing themselves over Coketown. A clattering of clogs upon the pavement, a rapid ringing of bells, and all the melancholy mad elephants, polished and oiled up for the day's monotony, were at their heavy exercise again. Stephen bent over his loom, quiet, watchful, and steady. A special contrast, as every man was in the forest of looms where Stephen worked, to the crashing, smashing, tearing piece of mechanism at which he laboured. Never fear, good people of an anxious turn of mind, that art will consign nature to oblivion. Set anywhere, side by side, the work of God and the work of man, and the former, even though it be a troop of hands of very small account, will gain in dignity from the comparison. So many hundred hands in this mill, so many hundred horse steam power. It is known, to the force of a single pound weight, what the engine will do. But not all the calculators of the national debt can tell me the capacity for good or evil, for love or hatred, for patriotism or discontent, for the decomposition of virtue into vice, or the reverse, at any single moment in the soul of one of these its quiet servants, with the composed faces and the regulated actions. There is no mystery in it. There is an unfathomable mystery in the meanest of them forever. Supposing we were to reverse our arithmetic for material objects, and to govern these awful unknown quantities by other means. The day grew strong, and showed itself outside, even against the flaming lights within. The lights were turned out, and the work went on. The rain fell, and the smoke serpents, submissive to the curse of all that tribe, trailed themselves upon the earth. In the waste-yard outside, the steam from the escape-pipe, the litter of barrels and old iron, the shining heaps of coals, the ashes everywhere, were shrouded in a veil of mist and rain. The work went on until the noon bell rang. More clattering upon the pavements. The looms and wheels and hands all out of gear for an hour. Stephen came out of the hot mill into the damp wind and cold wet street, haggard and worn. He turned from his own class and his own quarter, taking nothing but a little bread as he walked along towards the hill on which his principal employer lived, in a red house with black outside shutters, green inside blinds, a black street door, up two white steps, Bounderby, in letters very like himself, upon a brazen plate, and a round brazen door-handle underneath it, like a brazen full stop. The Bounderby was at his lunch, so Stephen had expected. Would his servant say that one of the hands begged leave to speak to him? Message in return requiring name of such hand. Stephen Blackpool. There was nothing troublesome against Stephen Blackpool. Yes, he might come in. Stephen Blackpool in the parlour. Mr. Bounderby, whom he just knew by sight, at lunch on chop and sherry. Mrs. Sparsit netting at the fireside in a side-saddle attitude, with one foot in a cotton stirrup. It was a part at once of Mrs. Sparsit's dignity and service not to lunch. She supervised the meal officially, but implied that in her own stately person she considered lunch a weakness.
"Now, Stephen,"
said Mr. Bounderby,
"what's the matter with you?"
Stephen made a bow. Not a servile one. These hands will never do that. Lord bless you, sir, you'll never catch them at that, if they had been with you 20 years. And, as a complimentary toilet for Mrs. Sparsit, tucked his neckerchief ends into his waistcoat.
"Now, you know,"
said Mr. Bounderby, taking some sherry,
"we have never had any difficulty with you, and you've never been one of the unreasonable ones. You don't expect to be set up in a coach and six, and to be fed on turtle soup and venison with a gold spoon, as many of 'em do."
Mr. Bounderby always represented this to be the sole, immediate, and direct object of any hand who was not entirely satisfied.
"And therefore I know already that you've not come here to make a complaint. Now, you know, I'm certain of that beforehand."
"No, sir. Sure I'll not come for nought at kind."
Mr. Bounderby seemed agreeably surprised, notwithstanding his previous strong conviction.
"Very well,"
he returned.
"You're a steady hand, and I was not mistaken. Now, let me hear what it's all about. As it's not that, let me hear what it is. What have you got to say? Out with it, lad."
Stephen happened to glance towards Mrs. Sparsit.
"I can go, Mr. Bounderby, if you wish it,"
said that self-sacrificing lady, making a feint of taking her foot out of the stirrup. Mr. Bounderby stayed her by holding a mouthful of chop in suspension before swallowing it, and putting out his left hand. Then, withdrawing his hand and swallowing his mouthful of chop, he said to Stephen,
"Now, you know, this good lady is a born lady, a high lady. You're not to suppose, because she keeps my house for me, that she hasn't been very high up in the tree. Aye, up at the top of the tree. Now, if you've got anything to say that can't be said before a born lady, this lady will leave the room. If what you've got to say can be said before a born lady, this lady will stay where she is."
"Sir, I hope I never had nowt say not fitting for a born lady here sin I were a born mysen,"
was the reply, accompanied with a slight flush.
"Very well,"
said Mr. Bounderby, pushing away his plate and leaning back.
"Fire away."
"I come,"
Stephen began, raising his eyes from the floor after a moment's consideration,
"to ask you your advice. I need overmuch. I were married on Easter Monday 19 year sin, long and dree. She were a young lass, pretty enow, with good account of hersen. Well, she went bad soon. Nor along o' me. Gunnos I were nor an unkind husband to her."
"Now, I've heard all this before,"
said Mr. Bounderby.
"She took to drinking, left off working, sold the furniture, pawned the clothes, and played old gooseberry."
"I were patient wi' her."
"The more fool you, I think,"
said Mr. Bounderby, in confidence to his wine-glass.
"I were very patient wi' her. I tried wean her from it hour and hour again. I tried this, and I tried that, and I tried t'other. I gone home many time and found all vanished as I had it world. And who he has a sense left to bless hersen lying up bare ground. I had done not once, not twice, 20 time."
Every line in his face deepened as he said it, and put in its affecting evidence of the suffering he had undergone.
"From bad to worse, from worse to worsen, she left me. She disgraced hersen everyways, bitter and bad. She come back, she come back, she come back. What could I do to hinder her? I ha' walked streets nights long ere ever I'd go home. I gone to t' brig, minded to fling mysel' o'er, and I no more on't. I abhorred that much that I were owd when I were young."
Mrs. Sparsit, easily ambling along with her netting needles, raised the Coriolanian eyebrows and shook her head, as much as to say,
"The great no trouble as well as the small. Please to turn your humble eye in my direction."
"I ha' paid her to keep away from me. These 5 years I paid her. I ha' gotten decent fowtals about me again. I had lived hard and sad, but nor ashamed, and fearful a minutes o' my life. Last night I went home. There she lay upon th' hearthstone. There she is."
In the strength of his misfortune and the energy of his distress, He fired for the moment like a proud man. In another moment he stood as he had stood all the time, his usual stoop upon him, his pondering face addressed to Mr. Bounderby with a curious expression on it, half shrewd, half perplexed, as if his mind were set upon unravelling something very difficult, his hat held tight in his left hand, which rested on his hip, his right arm, with a rugged propriety and force of action, very earnestly emphasizing what he said, not least so when it always paused, a little bent, but not withdrawn, as he paused.
"I was acquainted with all this, you know,"
said Mr. Bounderby.
"except the last clause, long ago. It's a bad job, that's what it is. You had better been satisfied as you were, and not have got married. However, it's too late to say that."
Was it an unequal marriage, sir, in point of years?
asked Mrs. Sparsit.
You hear what this lady asks. Was it an unequal marriage, in point of years, this unlucky job of yours?
asked Mr. Bounderby.
Nor e'en so. I were 21 mysen, and she were 20 now, but.
Indeed, sir,
said Mrs. Sparsit to her chef, with great placidity.
I inferred from its being so miserable a marriage that it was probably an unequal one in point of years.
Mr. Bounderby looked very hard at the good lady in a sidelong way that had an odd sheepishness about it. He fortified himself with a little more sherry.
"Well, why don't you go on?"
he then asked, turning rather irritably on Stephen Blackpool.
"I come to ask you, sir, how I am to be rid of this woman."
Stephen infused a yet deeper gravity into the mixed expression of his attentive face. Mrs. Sparsit uttered a gentle ejaculation, as having received a moral shock.
"What do you mean?"
said Bounderby, getting up to lean his back against the chimney-piece.
"What are you talking about? You took her for better, for worse."
"I mun be rid of her. I can't bear no more. I have lived under so long for that I hadn't had pity and comforting words at best last living or dead. Happily, but for her, I should have gone battering mad."
He wishes to be free, to marry the female of whom he speaks, I fear, sir,
observed Mrs. Sparsit in an undertone, and much dejected by the immorality of the people.
"I do. Lady says what's right, I do. I were coming to it, and I read it papers that great folk, fair for to 'em, I wish 'em no hurt, are not bonded together for better for worse so fast that they can't be set free from the misfort'nate marriages and marry o'er again. When they dunna agree for that the tempers is ill sorted, they has rooms o' one kind or another in their houses above a bit that they can live asunders. We folk hae only one room, and we can't. When that won't do, they ha' gout and other cash, and they can say this for yo and that for me, and they can go their separate ways. We can't. Spite of all that, they can be set free for smaller wrongs than mine, so I mun be rid of this woman, and I want to know how."
"Know how?"
returned Mr. Bounderby.
"If I do any hurt, sir, there's a law to punish me.
"Of course there is."
If I flee from her, there's a law to punish me.
"Of course there is."
If I marry t'other dear lass, there's a law to punish me.
"Of course there is."
If I were to live wi' her and not marry her, saying such things could be, which it never could or would, and her so good, there's a law to punish me and every innocent child belonging to me."
"Of course there is."
"Now, a God's name,"
said Stephen Blackpool,
"show me the law to help me."
"There's a sanctity in this relation of life,"
said Mr. Bounderby,
"and it must be kept up."
No, dunna say that. Don't keep up that way, not that way. 'Tis kept down that way. I'm a weaver. I were in a factory when I were a child, but I ain't got neen to see wi, and I earn't to hear wi. I read it papers, every sizes, every sessions, and you can read too, I know it, with dismay, how th' supposed impossibility of getting unchained from one another at any price, on any terms, brings blood upon this land, and brings many common married folk to battle, murder, and sudden death. Let us have this right understood. Mine is a grievous case, and I want, if you will be so good, to know the law that helps me."
"Now, I tell you what,"
said Mr. Bounderby, putting his hands in his pockets.
"there is such a law."
Stephen, subsiding into his quiet manner, and never wandering in his attention, gave a nod.
But it's not for you at all. It costs money. It costs a mint of money.
How much might that be?
Stephen calmly asked.
Why, you'd have to go to Doctors' Commons with your suit, and you'd have to go to a court of common law with your suit, and you'd have to go to the House of Lords with your suit, and you'd have to get an Act of Parliament to enable you to marry again, and it would cost you, if it was a case of very plain sailing, I suppose from £1,000 to £1,500,
said Mr. Bounderby.
Perhaps twice the money.
There's no other law?
Certainly not.
Why then, sir?
Said Stephen, turning white and motioning with that right hand of his, as if he gave everything to the four winds.
'Tis a muddle. 'Tis just a muddle altogether, and the sooner I'm dead the better.
Mrs. Sparsit again dejected by the impiety of the people.
Oh, don't you talk nonsense, my good fellow,
said Mr. Bounderby,
about things you don't understand. And don't you call the institutions of your country a muddle, or you'll get yourself into a real muddle one of these fine mornings. The institutions of your country are not your piecework, and the only thing you've got to do is to mind your piecework. You didn't take your wife for fast and for loose, but for better for worse. If she's turned out worse, why, all we've got to say is, she might have turned out better.
'Tis a muddle,
said Stephen, shaking his head as he moved to the door.
'Tis a muddle.
Now, I'll tell you what,
Mr. Bounderby resumed, as a valedictory address.
With what I shall call your unhallowed opinions, you've been quite shocking this lady, who, as I've already told you, is a born lady, and who, as I've not already told you, has had her own marriage misfortunes, to the tune of tens of thousands of pounds. Tens of thousands of pounds.
He repeated it with great relish.
Now, you've always been a steady hand heretofore, but my opinion is, and so I tell you plainly, that you are turning into the wrong road. You've been listening to some mischievous stranger or other. They're always about, and the best thing you can do is to come out of that. Now, you know, I can see as far into a grindstone as any other man, farther than a good many, perhaps, because I had my nose well kept to it when I was young. I see traces of the turtle soup and venison and gold spoon in this. Yes, I do,
cried Mr. Bounderby, shaking his head with obstinate cunning.
By the Lord Harry, I do.
With a very different shake of the head and deep sigh, Stephen said,
Thank you, sir. I wish you good day.
So he left Mr. Bounderby swelling at his own portrait on the wall, as if he were going to explode himself into it, and Mrs. Sparsit still ambling on with her foot in her stirrup, looking quite cast down by the popular vices. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 12. The Old Woman. Old Stephen descended the 2 white steps, shutting the black door with the brazen door-plate by the aid of the brazen full-stop, to which he gave a parting polish with the sleeve of his coat, observing that his hot hand clouded it. He crossed the street with his eyes bent upon the ground, and thus was walking sorrowfully away, when he felt a touch upon his arm. It was not the touch he needed most at such a moment, the touch that could calm the wild waters of his soul, as the uplifted hand of the sublimest love and patience could abate the raging of the sea. Yet it was a woman's hand too. It was an old woman, tall and shapely still, though withered by time, on whom his eyes fell when he stopped and turned. She was very cleanly and plainly dressed, had country mud upon her shoes, and was newly come from a journey. The flutter of her manner in the unwonted noise of the streets, the spare shawl carried unfolded on her arm, the heavy umbrella and little basket, the loose long-fingered gloves to which her hands were unused, all bespoke an old woman from the country in her plain holiday clothes, come into Coketown on an expedition of rare occurrence. Remarking this at a glance, with the quick observation of his class, Stephen Blackpool bent his attentive face, which, like the faces of many of his order, by dint of long working with eyes and hands in the midst of a prodigious noise, had acquired the concentrated look with which we are familiar in the countenances of the deaf, the better to hear what she asked him.
"Pray, sir,"
said the old woman,
"didn't I see you come out of that gentleman's house?"
pointing back to Mr. Bounderby.
"I believe it was you, unless I've had the bad luck to mistake the person in following."
"Yes, missus,"
returned Stephen.
"It were me."
"Have you'll excuse an old woman's curiosity, have you seen the gentleman?"
"Yes, missus."
"And how did he look, sir? Was he portly, bold, outspoken and hearty?"
As she straightened her own figure, and held up her hand in adapting her action to her words, the idea crossed Stephen that he had seen this old woman before, and had not quite liked her.
"Oh, yes,"
he returned, observing her more attentively.
"He were all that."
"And healthy?"
said the old woman.
"As fresh as the wind?"
"Yes,"
returned Stephen.
"He were etting and drinking, as large and as loud as home be."
"Thank you,"
said the old woman, with infinite content.
"Thank you."
He certainly never had seen this old woman before, yet there was a vague remembrance in his mind, as if he had more than once dreamed of some old woman like her. She walked along at his side, and gently accommodating himself to her humour, he said Coketown was a busy place, was it not? To which she answered,
"Ay, sure, dreadful busy."
Then, he said, she came from the country, he saw? To which she answered in the affirmative.
"By Parliamentary this morning. I came 40 mile by Parliamentary this morning, and I'm going back the same 40 mile this afternoon. I walked 9 mile to the station this morning, and if I find nobody on the road to give me a lift, I shall walk the 9 mile back tonight. That's pretty well, sir, at my age,"
said the chatty old woman, her eye brightening with exultation.
"'Deed it is. Don't do it too often, missus."
"No, no, once a year,"
she answered, shaking her head.
"I spend my savings so once every year. I come regular to tramp about the streets and see the gentlemen."
"Only to see 'em?"
returned Stephen.
"That's enough for me,"
she replied, with great earnestness and interest of manner.
"I ask no more. I've been standing about on this side of the way to see that gentleman,"
turning her head back towards Mr. Bounderby's again.
"come out, but he's late this year, and I have not seen him. You came out instead. Now, if I am obliged to go back without a glimpse of him, I only want a glimpse. Well, I have seen you, and you have seen him, and I must make that do."
Saying this, she looked at Stephen as if to fix his features in her mind, and her eye was not so bright as it had been. With a large allowance for difference of tastes, and with all submission to the patricians of Coketown, this seemed so extraordinary a source of interest to take so much trouble about, that it perplexed him. But they were passing the church now, and as his eye caught the clock, he quickened his pace. He was going to work, the old woman said, quickening hers too, quite easily. Yes, time was nearly out. On his telling her where he worked, the old woman became a more singular old woman than before.
"Ain't you happy?"
she asked him.
"Why, there's almost nobody but has the troubles, missus."
He answered evasively, because the old woman appeared to take it for granted that he would be very happy indeed, and he had not the heart to disappoint her. He knew that there was trouble enough in the world, and if the old woman had lived so long, and could count upon his having so little, why, so much the better for her, and none the worse for him.
Ay, ay. You have your troubles at home, you mean?
She said.
Times, just now and then,
he answered slightly.
But working under such a gentleman, they don't follow you to the factory.
No, no, they didn't follow him there, said Stephen. All correct there, everything accordant there. He did not go so far as to say, for her pleasure, that there was a sort of divine right there, but I have heard claims almost as magnificent of late years. They were now in the black by-road near the place, and the hands were crowding in. The bell was ringing, and the serpent was a serpent of many coils, and the elephant was getting ready. The strange old woman was delighted with the very bell. It was the beautifulest bell she had ever heard, she said, and sounded grand. She asked him, when he stopped good-naturedly to shake hands with her before going in, how long he had worked there.
12 years,
he told her.
I must kiss the hand,
said she,
that has worked in this fine factory for 12 years.
And she lifted it, though he would have prevented her, and put it to her lips. What harmony besides her age and her simplicity surrounded her, he did not know, but even in this fantastic action there was a something neither out of time nor place, a something which it seemed as if nobody else could have made as serious, or done with such a natural and touching air. He had been at his loom full half an hour, thinking about this old woman, when, having occasion to move round the loom for its adjustment, he glanced through the window which was in his corner, and saw her still looking up at the pile of building, lost in admiration. Heedless of the smoke and mud and wet, and of her 2 long journeys, she was gazing at it as if the heavy thrum that issued from its many stories were proud music to her. She was gone by and by, and the day went after her, and the lights sprung up again, and the express whirled in full sight of the fairy palace over the arches near, little felt amid the jarring of the machinery, and scarcely heard above its crash and rattle. Long before then his thoughts had gone back to the dreary room above the little shop, and to the shameful figure, heavy on the bed, but heavier on his heart. Machinery slackened, throbbing feebly like a fainting pulse, stopped. The bell again. The glare of light and heat dispelled. The factories looming heavy in the black wet night, their tall chimneys rising up into the air like competing towers of Babel. He had spoken to Rachel only last night, it was true, and had walked with her a little way, but he had his new misfortune on him, in which no one else could give him a moment's relief, and for the sake of it, and because he knew himself to want that softening of his anger which no voice but hers could effect, he felt he might so far disregard what she had said as to wait for her again. He waited, but she had eluded him. She was gone. On no other night in the year could he so ill have spared her patient face. Oh, better to have no home in which to lay his head, than to have a home and dread to go to it through such a cause. He ate and drank, for he was exhausted, but he little knew or cared what. And he wandered about in the chill rain, thinking and thinking, and brooding and brooding. No word of a new marriage had ever passed between them, but Rachel had taken great pity on him years ago, and to her alone he had opened his closed heart all this time on the subject of his miseries, and he knew very well that if he were free to ask her, she would take him. He thought of the home he might at that moment have been seeking with pleasure and pride, of the different man he might have been that night, of the lightness then in his now heavy-laden breast, of the then restored honour, self-respect, and tranquillity, all torn to pieces. He thought of the waste of the best part of his life, of the change it made in his character for the worse every day, of the dreadful nature of his existence, bound hand and foot to a dead woman, and tormented by a demon in her shape. He thought of Rachel, how young when they were first brought together in these circumstances, how mature now, how soon to grow old. He thought of the number of girls and women she had seen marry, how many homes with children in them she had seen grow up around her, how she had contentedly pursued her own lone quiet path for him, and how he had sometimes seen a shade of melancholy on her blessed face that smote him with remorse and despair. He set the picture of her up beside the infamous image of last night, and thought, could it be that the whole earthly course of one so gentle, good, and self-denying was subjugate to such a wretch as that? Filled with these thoughts, so filled that he had an unwholesome sense of growing larger, of being placed in some new and diseased relation towards the objects among which he passed, of seeing the iris round every misty light turn red, he went home for shelter. End of chapter 12.